All right, guys, let's start then. Today is our Introduction to Marvelous Designer class. I think it's been a long time coming. We have quite a lot of classes right now on Outgang.studio that is related to Marvelous Designer, but we have never made a actual introduction class per se. So a class that really delves into like all of the very basics of the software. There's a few surprises here in the sense that there's a few things that I'll talk about today that I haven't talked about in other contexts before on the website and on the classes that we have already produced for Marvelous Designers. So there are a few nuggets here that is interesting for those of you who have already produced a few garments by yourself inside of Marvelous Designer. But it will mostly be concentrated at a front end of the class, I believe. So if you feel after like 30 minutes that it already gets into things that you've already seen, which will very likely be the case if you have already produced a few garments inside of Marvelous Designer, you can feel free to skip pretty much everything else as far as this class is concerned. But if you are new to Marvelous Designer, you have never touched it before, today is a class that is meant specifically for you, just to ease you into the content a little bit there. You'll see that on the website, the classes that follow this one, at least for the time being, we'll see, of course, in the future, we may record other sort of beginner to intermediate classes. But right now, the way that it is meant, this class comes right before the first class where we break down a sketch, a garment 3D sketch, and we start to sketch out garments. Those who have already seen a lot of the classes that I have produced here know that I like to use this this kind of inverse approach where we start to block out, we create garments using sculpture inside a ZBrush, and then we separate that into different cloth panels that we can import inside of Marvelous Designer. So a lot of my workflow is actually usually to go inside ZBrush first and then to go inside of Marvelous Designer with a base that has already been made, which is what the rest of the classes on Marvelous Designer on Outgang.studio are largely concerned about, at least the ones that immediately follow this one. But I believe that it's very, very useful, and it's very important to also know how to make garments inside of Marvelous Designer directly. Simpler garments, perhaps, but yet there is a lot of manipulation. There's a lot that we can do inside of software directly. So you don't need to have ZBrush there to be able to produce good quality garments inside of Marvelous Designer. But I do find that knowing ZBrush and knowing how to sketch garments in there does help quite a lot to make more advanced, more complicated, more unique things. So what we'll be doing today is mostly looking at more basic garments, more real-life garments, things that you could expect to see in the real world, and for which there's already quite a lot of information out there on the web as far as how to construct patterns for these sorts of things. All right, let me share my screen here. Before we get started looking at actual garments, let me just show you guys what is the course outline for today. So first I'll mention a few things that are new at the studio here. There's a few things that are housekeeping bits that I like to mention usually at the start of the class, so we'll be doing that. And then afterwards, we will be taking the first part of the class. So the way that I usually work, if you are new here, and I suspect that a lot of you are, these classes usually last about 3 hours long. The last few weeks, it has gone on to about 4 because there's simply a lot of content to go through. And I would rather throw a lot of content your way and have you guys who are here live have your head start to hurt a little bit. I would rather do that so that on the recording afterward, you guys have plenty of good information to go back and rewatch and to really delve into and spend a lot of time to really study there. So yeah, today won't be any exception. There's a lot to go through. This is the only introduction to Marvelous Designer class we'll be recording for now, so I want to make sure that we cover all the bases, which means that the information today will be very complete as far as the basics are concerned, but it will also be quite a lot to take in there. So certainly it is recommended that if you are new to Marvelous Designer that you watch this and rewatch the class afterward a few times. But so the idea is that we have about 3 hours of content to go through. We will be going through half of that before taking a break. We usually take a break at around 1:45. And it is noon right now. It's noon, it's about 10 minutes past. So we'll take a break in about an hour, 40 minutes, and then we'll simply have more content to go through afterward. So, and at the end of that, at the end of the class, you can see here around 3 p.m., we'll have a Q&A, as we do. Actually, it should be here, but time-wise, I'm notoriously bad to sticking to a schedule there. So we'll see how that goes, really. But yeah, so around 3 p.m., we'll have our Q&A. Which is a chance for you guys to ask me questions. Now, for today specifically, I would really like for you guys, if you do have any questions, to ask them live as we go on and do the recording. So we'll see if even having a separate Q&A at the end really makes sense or not. We'll see the kind of questions that we get. And, there are times where we get to the Q&A period and there simply isn't much to talk about. And that is completely fine too. So if that happens today, then that's what it's going to be. Especially if there are interesting stuff that get talked about during the class there. So before the break, we'll be more or less covering the very basics of the software, how to manipulate the software, how to navigate in there, how to create very basic garments. The idea is to essentially, from now until the break, to get you to do all the basic manipulations that you need to do to be able to successfully model a simple garment inside of Marvelous Designer. And then after the break, we'll delve into things that are a bit more, I wouldn't say necessarily advanced, but things that kind of fit between beginner knowledge and sort of intermediate ones. So more about the basics, but the basics that you may use to create more advanced patterns, I suppose, than the very, very basic things that we'll do before the break there. So that's kind of the idea for the class that we have today. What is Marvelous Designer then? Let's really start to delve really deep into this. And let's talk about Marvelous Designer. But first, before we actually talk about the software, I actually want to talk a little bit about how we did things before Marvelous Designer was there. And there's a bit of I think there's a bit of an art that is getting lost a little bit, which is funny because like 3D hasn't actually been around for like a while, but like we're already at the point that I feel as if there are old ways of working that are kind of getting lost with time a little bit, since things just change so quickly in our industry and with new technology and stuff. There's a bit of an art of sculpting folds, I believe, that is that we are kind of losing with time a little bit. So I just wanted to show you guys how we did things beforehand. Now, I'm not going to give you guys a class as to how to sculpt folds, but we can certainly do that at some point. I think that could be a very interesting topic. But essentially, of course, before Marvelous Designer was there, we had to sculpt everything. Everything had to be done completely from scratch. And, we would do that using just a bunch of pictures as references for the most part. It was super important then, while we were actually doing that, to really develop really strong knowledge of folds, which is kind of where all the content or where the knowledge on fold anatomy that I personally have kind of more or less comes from. Now, this is a character from Deus Ex, from Mankind Divided, which is the last project I worked on that was not using Marvelous Designer, essentially. So we had to essentially sculpt everything there. Now, back then, I didn't understand folds as well as I understand them now, but I kind of understood them in a way that's a bit more perhaps implicit or indirect. I kind of understood all the concepts of like, okay, well, folds, they have to create all these diamond folds and like stuff like that. If I like zoom in on the pants here, perhaps we can kind of take a look at that here, So like, I certainly understood all the concept of like diamond folds and like stuff like that. And we really kind of did our best to try and sculpt the most naturalistic folds that we could. But also at the same time, as you can see, a lot of these diamonds here, they're very perfectly diamond-ish, since just like with everything related to 3D art, I think we have a tendency to also kind of idealize a little bit the shape of things. But that perhaps would be a topic for like a different time, So like all of the thing between like memory folds that we have talked about previously on Outgang.studio, and on which we certainly have a class. So the class, the theoretical class on cloth and fold anatomy, like really does a beautiful breakdown of like all of these things. But like back then, like we had to like study these things and really develop knowledge there that was even more explicit because we couldn't rely on Marvelous Designer, of course, to give us great simulation to work off of. So everything had to be completely sculpted from scratch. But for the most part, I've always thought that like, I mean, fold sculpting has always simply been one of the things I've always kind of enjoyed to do. I think it takes a very specific mind to enjoy it, though, because like fold sculpting is actually quite. It can be quite time consuming, you know, and there's like this really high attention to detail that you kind of need to be able to do that properly. But at the same time, I find it very relaxing. You know, it's like those of us who know how to do retopology, how to do UVs. You know, like if you talk to a lot of seniors, there's a lot of seniors who are like, yeah, I just really love to do like retopology and like UVs and stuff. Not just seniors. There's a bunch of juniors too that do that, of course. But like, there's maybe this misconception that like somehow these things people usually don't enjoy them. And I mean, I certainly think that there's a lot of people who don't enjoy to do retopology and UVs, but you'd be surprised how many 3D artists actually enjoy the like those things that are a bit more could seem monotonous on the surface. And I think that fold sculpting is kind of one of those. You know, there's something that's actually very interesting, very liberating about sculpting folds. Yes, so essentially, folds for me, it's something that's I've always kind of liked, you know, and I always thought I was kind of good at it. There's a funny thing that kind of happened related to that. When I went for my interview at Guerrilla Games, there was a moment where we were actually going through my portfolio. And during the interview, the people there who had interviewed me, the topic changed to cloth sculpting at some point and just stuff related to cloth, you know? And they were actually looking at this character, and some of the people there, so I won't say who, but some of the people there, if you do listen to this, you know who you are, told me something that was very interesting. He told me like, yeah, like I think you know Marvelous Designer really well. I can see this character here that you have made. I can see like all the bits that are very Marvelous Designer-ish, you know, that sort of came out of the software and stuff. Like he could see the Marvelous Designer simulation through this garment that you guys are looking at right now. And then I kindly reminded him in the end, well, I actually hand sculpted everything. Like there's no Marvelous here at all. Like it's all hand sculpted. And I kind of at that time, at the same time, more or less admitted that I had not touched Marvelous Designer in any point before. So like I've actually personally only learned Marvelous Designer these last few years because before I used to hand sculpt pretty much everything. And when I told them like, yeah, I like there's no way I did this inside of Marvelous because I don't even know the software. And their reaction to that was, oh, well, I think we really need you then. Because I think that they saw the fact that like if you're really great at sculpting folds, like all of the knowledge that you need is there, you know, like how to sculpt folds, like how do folds get created, what makes folds look good and bad, you know? So at that point, even if you don't know Marvelous Designer, like the software itself, but you show that you really understand folds really well, you have knowledge there that is of a very, very high value for a different studio, you know? So maybe you don't know Marvelous, but if you're just interested by the topic of cloth and folds and stuff like that, just as a topic that is completely detached from the topic of Marvelous Designer, you will develop their knowledge that may even be more important than the knowledge related to Marvelous Designer directly, because people will simply see that you know folds at a deeper level than simply how to manipulate a piece of software, and you really understand what makes folds great or not great, you know. And at that point, if you don't know a particular piece of software, it's a very easy thing to teach. And that's been true my whole career, you know. Like that's why I say sometimes, and certainly what we were talking about last week with Guillaume about the fact that, like some people sometimes they over focus on software when they're within an interview, especially juniors. They think that they need to prove that they know different software. It's like, no, we don't really care about that. Like if you show us that you understand the content that you are working on at a deeper level than simply how to manipulate a software to create it, that knowledge that you have is a way higher value and importance to a studio than whether you know, let's say, Maya, or whether you only know Blender, really. So at that point, like how it usually works is we hire people, and for the first few months, we simply train them on whichever software they don't actually know. So that's often how that goes. But of course, in the topic of cloth sculpting, like it's not something that's very all that common anymore. You can still find tutorials on how to do it left and right, but for the most part, I mean, like it's an art that is more or less getting lost, I feel like. So at some point, certainly I'll probably give you guys a class on that, because I think that it's something that's very fun to do, like how to sculpt folds. Like there's a few different brushes there that we will use that we have never really used in another context before. Now, I have talked about cloth and fold sculpting throughout the different classes on Outgang so far. That knowledge is already kind of there, and it's kind of spread over a few different classes there. But right now, we don't have like an actual classes dedicated to that. I think it could be interesting to produce that at some point. Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I wanted to say on that. So this is what we used to do before. Now, the reason why we've kind of largely moved over to simulation software, such as Marvelous Designer, to start to create our garments now, the reasons, they should be relatively obvious. One of the biggest drawbacks of cloth and fold sculpting is that it's hard. It's highly skilled. Not a lot of people know how to do it well. There's a lot of issues too when you're working on a production. If, let's say, you are working with different artists that have learned how to sculpt folds a bit differently, you're going to have a hard time if everyone's sculpting folds to bring everyone to a consistent art style. That's one of the challenges when things are created manually, of course. But if you are using Marvelous Designer as a software, you know that the data you're going to get from it, there's a certain uniformity that you can expect in terms of style of treatment of folds, if you will, because everyone is using the same software. So there's that. But also, like, it simply is a lot harder to sculpt folds, I think, than to use Marvelous Designer. So there too, like, if you hand sculpt too many folds on production, there's a chance that the quality of these folds that will be sculpted will be of a variable quality, because different people understand folds in different ways. Not everyone is as good at sculpting folds. So you get a lot of variation in terms of the result that people get. Those are kind of the concerns that actually kind of go through your mind when you're lead, more than anything else, really. But yeah, it simply makes a lot of sense for most productions to switch pretty much completely to Marvelous Designer as the creation tool. So that brings us essentially to this piece of software. So you don't really need to know how to sculpt folds as much as you really need to simply know how to use this here. So inside of the software itself, let me maximize this. We can start to delve into the software a little bit now. I suspect that my face will be a problem for most of the stream because I like to work inside of Marvelous Designer when the UI kind of looks like this, and my face right now is kind of blocking the bottom part. Good thing that he's not naked. I guess I could actually show naked models on stream if I just place my things like this. If he wasn't actually wearing boxers, I could definitely just work on the character like this, and then you would be none the wiser, really. But I don't think that's going to work. So I'll see if my face becomes a big problem, guys. Especially those who are here in the chat. Please let me know. Also, I do have a tendency sometimes to explain things, and I don't have my own face on my screen when I am recording. So sometimes I have tendency to point to things with my mouse that are under the portrait that you guys, where you guys can see my face. So if I do that and you guys feel as if you're missing out on something that looks critical as far as information, please let me know, and I will correct that. But unfortunately, sometimes I kind of get into flow and I kind of lose track of my UI there. But I'll try to keep that in mind. All right, we'll see how it goes. I think it shouldn't be too bad for most of the stream. So, okay. Marvelous Designer, then. If we take a look here, let's start by just looking at the UI a little bit. let's try to kind of study where everything is in terms of placement on the screen, in terms of UI, toolbars, these sorts of things, before we really start to talk about actual garments and how to create these things. Let's just talk about more the basics of the UI. So first here we have our 3D window. As you guys can see, I have already loaded a garment inside of here too, of course. If you guys were to load an empty scene, I suppose I could do that, and we'll bring this back on the screen laterwards. So we'll just go ahead here and erase everything. So this is pretty much what it looks like when you open Marvelous Designer for the first time and you don't have any garments in here. So here on the left, you have what we call the 3D window, and then on the right, you have the 2D window. Very simple, really nothing that's all that complicated about it. The 3D window is more or less your display of things. There's not a lot of work that we do inside a 3D window. There are some garment manipulation we'll do in here, of course, but for the most part, it's actually a 2D window where we do most of the garment building and construction. So most of the 2D window is where we'll spend most of the time working, and then we'll simply use a 3D window to check the work that we are doing, look at what it is. And there are certain manipulations we'll do in a 3D window as well, but not as much as what we'll do in a 2D window. So about the interface. So this is your 3D window, this is your 2D window. Next to it here, there is this, this thing here that's called Object Browser on top. So this is pretty much just a navigator, just to go through a bunch of different things that you would have in your scene. Here, scene, you can see the actual things that are within your scene. You can see there's a bunch of things here that are loaded by default. There's a few default lights, default cameras. Now, Marvelous Designer is not a rendering software, and it is not known for its rendering either. So don't try to make anything complicated. If you want to render a garment that you have created, use a different software. Don't try to do it in here. There's not even any reasons to even play with the lights and the camera and stuff. Maybe you want to change the FOV, but that's kind of it, really. And even then, have a tendency to keep the default most of the time. So for the most part, we'll disregard anything that has to do with lights, cameras. They don't matter. You can't get nice rendering in Marvelous Designer, even though like they're kind of trying to push that a little bit. It's like with every new version of Marvelous, to try to integrate new features. You can have like textures and lights and new rendering modes, and they keep releasing stuff like that, but it's not worth it. It's not worth to delve into that. Like, it's only worth it to create garments here, and let's do our rendering elsewhere. But other than that, so for the object browser here, so you have different things here. There's things called fabrics, buttons, and like other stuff. We'll come back on that when the time is right, really. But just keep in mind that this is to navigate kind of either through your scene or through the different things that you have within your scene, the different objects that you have in there. And then under here is the property editor. We'll spend a whole lot of time in here. Right now, it's completely empty. But if I do select this fabric here that is here in this scene by default, you'll see that there's a bunch of stuff here that now gets displayed here. A lot of these values are a bit more advanced, so we won't talk too much about a lot of what goes on in the property editor, but there is quite a lot of information on that is shared with you guys in the other classes that we have on outgang.studio as far as Marvelous Designer is concerned. So don't be afraid if you're new to Marvelous Designer. We won't spend a lot of time in this today, although we will spend a bit of time in here, but not too much. We won't look at a lot of these options, but they are covered in nice detail throughout the rest of the classes that we have. Over the 2D and 3D windows, we have toolbars, of course, just like every other software, really. And then on top of the toolbars here, we have a bunch of menus right on top here. So about these, first of all, the icons for the toolbars, as you can see, we have icons over our 2D window and we have icons over our 3D window. They're all icons to manipulate what you have in those windows, of course. That should go without saying. But what is interesting then perhaps to note already is that we have essentially very different icons for the tools to work in our 2D window versus the icons and the tools that we have for our 3D window. So the tools are always different between what we use for the 2D window and the 3D window, even going so far as the tool that you will use to select things will be different. And all the shortcuts are also completely different. It's practically two different software that is bundled into one, really. So all the manipulations are different. The tools are all different between the 2D window and the 3D window. So we will go back and forth between these two, but just keep that in mind. Essentially, that's kind of the reason why you have two separate toolbars, if you will, one over the 3D window and one over the 2D window. As far as the menu here is concerned, to be honest, there's not much in there that is of interest to us. Now, of course, just like every software, all the options you could ever want is somewhere in one of these menus, but everything that is really important to us is already into one of these toolbars. So truth be told, you probably won't spend a lot of time going through this here. And beyond the file menu and a few things inside of settings, there's not really a lot of reasons to go through these. I invite you to explore these. If you're kind of curious, you should certainly spend your time to go through these different menus just to see what's in there. But if you don't, you won't miss out on much, other than perhaps seeing the default shortcuts for things. Let me go ahead here and load one of the scenes that I had previously here, or just swap over to a different window here, since I have a lot of windows open with Marvelous Designer right now. That's kind of it, like when we load an actual garment here that has been created, you can start to see what this really looks like, right? So you have your 3D garment here, you have your 2D representation of the garment here. And just to give you guys a bit of an idea of how this works really, right? So if I wanted to create one of these new panels here, so we call these panels, all these different cloth pieces. You can see when I do select them here inside my 2D window, they also get highlighted in the 3D one. And if I wanted to just go in here and say, okay, so what does it look like if I create a new panel in here? How would that work? Well, it's actually very simple. You simply have to press H on your shortcut on your keyboard. H is the shortcut that will select the polygon creation tool that you have right here. Or you could click on this inside your 2D toolbar. You can see here, so polygon, or you press H. And this simply puts you in a mode where you can click and drag here inside your 2D window. And once you create a closed shape, it will quite simply create a panel of cloth that has the shape that you have given it, and it will appear inside your 3D window afterward, as you can see. Before we talk more about cloth and panels and stuff like that, it could also be worth to just cover the very basics of navigation inside the software itself, because you may be completely lost and you probably don't know what the shortcuts are. Now, there's a beautiful thing about Marvelous Designer, and I really like to see these kind of things in different software. So I certainly hope that other software that we commonly use start to do this more and more. Some software are already doing it, and which is to give you the choice that you want over the navigation or the shortcuts there. What I mean by that is, if we go here to settings and we go here to user settings, and we take a look at this here. So inside user settings, if we go to view controls here, these are essentially all the shortcuts that are used to translate, rotate, spin around, turn around the different garments that you'll have inside of Marvelous Designer. And you can actually swap this over to whichever preset that you like, really. So as you can see, I'm very much used to Maya's navigation, which is why I have selected this as my default. But I believe by default, it is on probably a regular mouse here. And so here you guys can see all the different shortcuts. Now, I won't talk more about the shortcuts. It should be self-explanatory. I assume most of you have already used another 3D software before, so you're probably quite familiar with how 3D navigation usually works. Therefore, you can just go in here and select whatever you're the most used with to begin with. Fortunately, there is no Blender, so for you Blender fans out there, there isn't that, but you could always change shortcuts yourself if ever you are not comfortable with any of these options. And so if you're not quite sure how to navigate inside of Marvelous Designer, just take a look at these. And if there's a preset that you already like, you'll be good to go very, very soon. So yeah, just go to settings, user settings, and there you go. It's all in there. While we're here, this is more for advanced users perhaps, but you could also go down here and you could change shortcuts. you guys can actually see here, if I go back to settings and user settings, you can see that now the shortcut is on F8, but that's not default. That's actually me who said, well, I like to go in here and I like to have, personally, I like to have F8 for that. There's no particular reasons. I just thought that it was kind of nice, you know? So I simply went in here and went to shortcuts, typed in user settings here, and have simply applied F8 as my default for that. So feel free to change. You can pretty much change almost all shortcuts inside of Marvelous Designer. So if something you're not used to it, it's worth to change it so that it's more comfortable for you, really. But I mean, that's kind of it. There isn't much more to say as far as the navigation is concerned. I think most of you, even if you're new to Marvelous Designer, you're certainly you are very unlikely to start with this as your first 3D software. So I'm not too worried for that. Perhaps coming back to the toolbar and to creating our first cloth panel here. As I said, one thing that you will see that is certainly a bit of an idiosyncrasy, if I can say it that way, as far as Marvelous Designer is concerned, is really the fact that like the selection tool are practically different. And like all the tools are pretty much different between the 2D and the 3D window. You know, like if you're used to 3D software, you know, and we have already defined that the shortcut H here will help you to create a new cloth panel somewhere that has a shape that you draw out. You know, you're probably used to the idea that, okay, you could press H and then you could go into your 3D window and you could create it there. You know, like most softwares have that, but Marvelous Designer does not have that, you know, which is why I'm saying that like it's really good to think about these two different windows as really two completely different software practically, because if I'm here on H, I can create a panel here with any shape that I want, but I cannot do that inside the 3D window. So just keep that in mind, you know, like if I want to go back here into a selection mode, because I want to select some of these panels that I have here. So the shortcut for that, to be able to select things and different cloth panels that you have created inside the 2D window, the shortcut to select things within the 2D window is you have to press A on your shortcut on your keyboard for that. So A puts you in this little icon here, transform pattern, and then you can afterward select anything that you have within your 2D window. You can do box selection, of course. All of that is great. But if you want to select things in the 3D window, then you have to press Q and you have to use this little thing here. So where it says select move, Q, that is the shortcut that you need to press if you want to select something and move something in the 3D window. You have to press Q, and it is A for the 2D window. That's kind of confusing, right? It's super confusing. But, you know, that's muscle memory. So, you know, once you've done it a few times, you'll kind of get used to it, and then you won't complain about it anymore. But it's like ZBrush. It's like the first time that you learn navigation, it's like always a bit of a, it's a bit of a mess, and, you know, you simply have to get used to it. So we'll go through a few different shortcuts that are important for both the 2D window and the 3D window, and I'll try to do my best to remember to mention them every time that we do that. If we press Z while we are in the 2D window, if you press Z here, we will be able to select individual points so that we can move individual points around and we can change the shape of the panels that we have previously created. And while we're there, you certainly have no doubt that if we press delete, we can erase points that we have created. And once we have started to create a panel like this, and we want to add a point somewhere, we have to press X to go into point creation mode, which allows us to simply add extra vertices. So here, if I want to manipulate this kind of triangle, I want to add points to it, I want to make it look like something that is different, what I will often do is simply press on Z, or press on X, going into point add mode. I will add a bunch of points like this. And then afterward, I will press Z or Z to be able to select the points that I have placed on my panel, and so that I can manipulate them and I can move them in their location that I want them to be. And then once I have the shape that I want, this particular panel, if I want to move the panel around somewhere else, then I will press A so that I can go in pattern selection mode. I can take now the pattern and I can move it somewhere else. And none of that, you can do that in the 3D window. You cannot add points, you can't subtract points, you can't even select points while you're in the 3D window. The only thing you can do is to select full panels. So that's kind of it. Like, that's your very basic how to create very basic panels. Now, of course, if that's all that we're doing, we still won't really get all that far inside of Marvelous Designer. Like, how far could we actually get if that's all that we know, right? We could start with an empty scene here. We could be like, okay, so let's create, just for the sake of it, let's create a new panel somewhere. There you go. That's super cool. All right, but what can we do with that now? There really isn't much that we can do with this. We could, of course, move this around a little bit. We could rotate it. We could even simulate it, of course, because this is a simulation software after all, right? So how do we simulate something then? Inside of Marvelous Designer, you simply have to press spacebar. It's as simple as that. Simply have to press spacebar on your keyboard, and whatever it is that you have within your scene will start to be simulated. So this little cloth panel will very gradually in this case, simply start to fall down and simply fall down. As you can see, it's very, very slow, but there you go. It's starting to fall down. So I have activated the simulation mode of Marvelous Designer. And you can find that with this little arrow that is on the top left here of your 3D toolbar. That is the simulation button that you need to press. So the shortcut for it is spacebar, or you can click on this little arrow here. And as you can see, when you click on that, simulation starts, which means that in this case, that this little, or rather this huge piece of cloth starts to simply fall down because there is gravity, but there is nothing else in the scene right now. Now, this isn't all that exciting. This is extremely slow. And there's really nothing that's all that fun that's kind of happening right now. One thing you have to know about Marvelous Designer is that simulation, cloth simulation, I mean, this is true whichever software that you are going to use to do simulation, really. But since we're focusing on Marvelous Designer here, that's kind of why I'm using that as a language, I suppose, for now. But cloth simulation is something that is extremely intensive for a computer to run. I happen right now to have one of the best computers that money can buy. I mean, that's not true. You can spend $50,000 for a computer, and I've certainly seen that. And you can get stuff that is miles beyond what I have. But I have a very, very good computer right now. And even here, turning on simulation, you can see that this is extremely slow right now. Like, this little thing really drops very, very slowly, you know? So this will happen to you no matter if you have a great computer or you have a really bad one. Performance inside of Marvelous Designer is a constant thing to worry about, and it's something you always have to kind of really pay attention to. So the biggest thing that affects simulation, there's really two things, like the two biggest things that you can change to get faster simulation, if you will, inside of Marvelous Designer. The first one is that you can reduce or control the density of the vertices that are simulated, you know, because this is a 3D software, of course. We work with vertices, we work with polygons, just the way that we work in any other software. But by default, these things are hidden from you. You don't see them. You can't really see the vertices here, right? Like, I mean, sure, we can see the points here, but those aren't vertices in a sense of what we usually consider to be a vertex in the context of a 3D software or of a 3D model, right? So if you actually want to see the actual vertices that are simulated, what I recommend is that in your 3D window, press Alt and then 5 on your keyboard. So Alt 5 will get you to switch over your screen, or your viewing mode, if you will, from a solid display for the garment that you had. Let me change the color of this, and I'll come back on this in just a second, but this will be a bit easier to see. So if you press Alt 5 on your keyboard, you will be able to see transparently see through. You will see the wireframe of your objects. And now we can actually appreciate the density of vertices that we have on our cloth panel. As you can see, there's quite a lot of them right now. There is quite a lot of those. So that will have a huge impact as far as simulation is concerned, of course. And so the question becomes, how do we control that then? How do we reduce that to have acceptable level of performance? And the answer to that is when you select a panel that you have created within your 2D window. Once you select one of these, you can see that now we have all these properties that show up in our property editor window for the panel that we have selected. And the most important variable in this case is a variable that we call particle distance. So as I select a cloth panel here, under simulation properties within our property editor, you can see a value here called particle distance. And right now its value is set to 10. Now, what does that mean, 10? It's actually in millimeters in this particular case, because I have my Marvelous Designer configured in centimeters. So this winds up being millimeters. Actually, this could be millimeters all the time, now that I think about it. But regardless, so here I have particle distance that's set to 10. And so what this means is that I'm pretty much good. I'm more or less going to have one vertex every centimeter or so. So that is more or less the distance between all these vertices. Now, there's really no reason to try and be scientific in how you're going to change this particular value. You'll see that people who use Marvelous Designer and do garment creation in there will have tendency to always be changing these values. You know, right now it's 10, you'll change it to 20 so that the particle distance, the distance between the vertices is higher. Therefore, your mesh will be of a lower density. That part is super weird, all right? Now, even myself get really kind of confused with this. Well, I mean, not confused, but like I get them mixed up when I talk all the time, all right? The relationship between your particle distance and the performance or the density is inverted. As you increase particle distance, as this value increases, you increase the distance between the vertices. Therefore, you are decreasing the density of your mesh. And by decreasing density, you are therefore increasing performance, right? So when people talk about density and they tell you, oh, your mesh is too dense, you should lower it, what they're really saying is you should increase the particle distance. That's what it means, you know. That's what you are going to hear. That's what people will say. So that's kind of like you kind of have to like mentally wrap your head around that. As the particle distance increases, density decreases. So what happens here if we say, okay, so what if I set particle distance to 30 or so, right? What happens then? Well, your cloth will simply automatically update itself with that new particle distance, which in turn will now give you a much faster simulation, as you guys can see. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, let me stop the simulation. So spacebar, start and stop simulation. As you can see, I'm still seeing the wireframe here because I pressed Alt 5. If I want to go back to seeing a solid display for my objects as I had before, I will simply press Alt 2 on my keyboard. So the Alt and the numbers, they essentially help you to cycle through the different display modes for your 3D window, really. That's kind of how it works. And just like with everything else, of course, we have different controls for the 2D window and the 3D window as it comes to display, just like everything else inside of Marvelous Designer. So here, Alt 2 shows me solid. Alt 5 shows me wireframe. There's more, you know, as you can imagine, there's also Alt 1, Alt 3, Alt 4, Alt, you know, so on and so forth. We won't talk about the other display mode for now, just to keep it contained as far as information is concerned. So just keep that in mind. Alt 2, Alt 5 between solid and wireframe display. But yeah, as you can see now, my simulation is a lot faster now because I have increased the particle distance and therefore reduced the density of my mesh. That's the first thing that you can do to increase performance. The second thing here, let me just do Control Z so that I can go back to this cloth the way that it looked before. And as you can see, you can undo simulations by doing Control Z here. So at this particular stage, before I had increased my particle distance here. So I have done undo enough that now my particle distance is set to 10 again. The other thing that I can do to increase performance is to switch the simulation mode, if you will, inside of Mars Designer. So inside Mars Designer 8, I believe it was 8. It could have been 9, but I think it was 8. But my memory could be wrong here. Whether it's 8 or 9, in the last versions of Mars Designer, they have finally introduced GPU simulation. Because by default, when you press on the simulation button right here, by default, what will happen is that you will simulate using the CPU. And the advantage of doing CPU simulation, which is a default here inside of Mars Designer, is that you get very precise results out of that simulation. You know, the way that a CPU works is that, like, sure, you usually have multiple CPUs now for modern computers, but you know, for the most part, the way that the CPU works and the way that the CPU does the simulation really is it more or less just simulates kind of every vertex one after the other there. So it's going to simulate one vertex, and it's going to quickly simulate the vertex right next to it and the vertex right next to it, and so on and so on and so forth, right? Which is why dense meshes have slowed down CPU simulation quite a lot, because that's how CPUs work. But they have introduced GPU simulation inside of Mars Designer a few versions ago. And to do that, to activate GPU simulation, you simply have to hold this button down, keep it pressed, hold the little arrow down, and just keep it pressed, and just go down here and select the fast GPU simulation mode. And this will change this to a hollow looking arrow pointing down, which tells you that you are now in GPU mode. And yeah, so are you guys ready for this? So we saw how like incredibly slow it was before, right? Now take a look at this. Let's turn on simulation. And there you go. So I still have my particle distance set to 10. And now take a look at how incredibly fast this is now. So GPU simulation is wonderful because now everything gets simulated, as opposed to every vertex that gets simulated one after the other on the CPU. Now you have kind of like a whole bunch of vertices that now get simulated in parallel on the GPU, which has the obvious advantage of being a lot faster. The disadvantage, though, the drawback of it, though, is that now you wind up having a simulation that lacks precision. So just keep that in mind, all right? GPU simulation, fast but imprecise. CPU simulation, very slow but very precise, because both of these things have their reasons to exist, and they all have their moment to shine. So just keep that in mind. Now, you've also seen me here, while my simulation button was actually turned on, while we are simulating our garment in our 3D window, I can actually pull on the garment. See, I can actually still just pull on this. I can actually yank on this. I can click on the garment and I can just move it around. See here how it's kind of like a bit of an elastic. I can like slap this on the ground as if it was like a wet towel or like something. Yeah, so essentially, while you are simulating, you're free to pull on the garment, and you'll see that there's a lot of manipulations. We often do that while we are kind of fitting a garment. We'll usually be sort of turning on simulation, and we'll start to pull on the garment in different ways just to make it fit better to a particular character there. So you can manipulate. Those are one of the manipulations that you will do within the 3D window. All right, enough of this very basic scene. Let's look at a garment that has been created, and let's break that down a little bit. So what do we have here? Here's a skirt. It's a very basic skirt. There's really nothing all that complicated about it. There's a bunch of pleats that have been made. I explained that in the pleat creation video on outgang.studio. There's a class dedicated to that, so I invite you to check that out if you want to see how to create these kind of basic skirts that have these kind of pleats like this. So here we have a skirt, right? So I can turn on simulation again. And then let's just see what happens here. So you can see first that this is solid as an arrow. Therefore, I am in CPU simulation. And we've seen how incredibly fast GPU simulation is. But if I'm honest, I still kind of prefer to work in CPU mode most of the time. And the advantage is because I want to take advantage of the extra precision that CPU mode gives us. Certainly when we start to deal with very complex garments and there's a lot of little pieces that interpenetrate in different, very subtle ways. I mean, usually garments don't interpenetrate, but that are kind of very close together there and certainly are at a risk of interpenetrating. The problem with CPU mode is that the precision of it is simply too low to be able to do a proper job in that case. So I tend to work in CPU mode most of the time, and I tend to simply keep my particle distance on the panels that I have at a relatively high value. Now, you can see here that this value is set to 3 right now, so that's certainly very low as a particle distance. But if we were working on this and let's say we set this back to 10 as a particle distance, you'll be able to see that, like, if I take a look at a wireframe now, this is the wireframe. This is what it looks like. So it's dense enough that I can certainly work and I can manipulate and I can construct this garment without too much of a problem. And I can certainly manipulate it here. I can kind of pull on it in different ways. I can sort of try and see and see how I can improve the fit by just yanking on it, yanking on the pattern. And I can work on this, and I'm in CPU mode right now. And I get a pretty acceptable performance, really. Like, all this is actually pretty acceptable as far as performance is concerned. So I have a tendency to work in CPU mode most of the time, and I'll simply swap over to GPU mode if there's something that I feel just simply takes too much time to simulate, but I would really want it to get closer to a more final state of simulation, I suppose, and I just don't want to stay there and just wait for it. And then I'll go into GPU mode. But the point that I'm making is that I keep CPU as a default, and I only use GPU when I feel as if it's necessary, as opposed to do it the other way around. So what can we kind of see from this particular scene now that we have an actual character, now that we have a bit of a garment here that has been created? What can we see? Well, first of all, there is a static character in the scene, of course. If I turn on simulation, I can pull on the garment, I can do a whole lot of stuff. I can move these around, I can move the panels around, I can do all sorts of stuff, but the character itself always stays completely static. And we call these characters avatars. So that is the exact terminology to use in the case of Marvelous Designer. We call these avatars. And it's very important that you know that, because that term is used pretty much everywhere. I can go here to File, I could try and save this file, I could go to Save, and I could save as, and I could save an avatar, and then you're like, well, what the hell is that? Well, that simply is a way to simply save your base body so that you could reuse the base body here on a different character to create a different garment, So avatars are something that we will manipulate regularly. Now, the truth is that avatar is actually a bit of a general term. Now, I'm using avatar here to describe an actual character, which is for the most part, which will be what you will have, just a static mesh that represents a character. But actually, the word avatar actually means anything in the scene that is simply not simulated. So I could have something like this here. Let me load a different scene. I believe it was this one. Let me just if I do Control Z here and go back to the original state here. So here's a naked avatar, right? So there's no garment here in the scene. You guys can see that my 2D window is completely empty, but I still have an avatar in the scene. And this avatar happens to have shoes. So the shoes are part of the avatar, even though they're not technically a character, although they are dressing up the character right now. But the point is that avatar is simply a label that we apply to anything inside of Marvelous Designer that is a static object. So an avatar doesn't have to be a character. If you're modeling a chair, you could use an avatar because you want to have, I'm not sure what you should have an avatar in the case of a chair, but there are cases where that could be useful. It's like, anything that's a static object is called an avatar. So just keep that in mind. So avatars do not simulate, but they do collide. So if I go here and I press H and I create just a little rectangle here. If I create just a little rectangle and I use this and then I manipulate it and I rotate it and I put it on top of his head, you'll see that essentially as I turn on simulation, this will fall on his head. So now he's wearing a towel. And so the avatar does not simulate, but it does react with garments. It does collide with them. And we can measure things on an avatar. We can do all sorts of things, and we'll talk about these things mostly after the break, actually. So there is a lot that depends on those. And they're usually the starting point. It's like before you create a garment, it's impossible to really create a garment if you don't have an avatar that represents the character on which you want to make a garment, of course. So it's always important to start with an avatar of some kind. Now, you could start with an avatar that you have created yourself. You know, like maybe you have something inside a ZBrush. Maybe there's a base body in there that you like. We could actually do that right now. Why don't we actually do that, right? Let's say that I do have a base body inside a ZBrush, and I want to use it as an avatar. It's very, very simple. Let's go ahead and do that. So let me simply load a base body here that I have. Here's a base body, right? So super simple. If I want to use this as an avatar inside of Marvelous Designer, let's simply export it out as an OBJ. And here, I guess I'll just put that on my desktop right now. So generic body, or maybe generic avatar or something. Export that as an OBJ. Go inside of Marvelous Designer. Go to File. Go to Import. OBJ. Sorry, maybe I did that a little too quickly. Let me do that again. Let me go to File, Import, and then OBJ here. This is what I'm selecting. You could load as FBX too, but I guess I'm just personally very used to using OBJs. So OBJs, there you go. Select your exported character. And it's as simple as that, really. You can use the default options here. But I guess the only thing that would be important here is just make sure that you're using centimeters. I prefer to work in centimeters inside of Marvelous Designer. I actually think that by default it's configured in millimeters, which is actually a bit of a problem because we really want to be using centimeters when we're creating stuff here. So I'm selecting centimeter here, and there you go. Now I have my base body inside of Marvelous Designer, and I can start to build garments around that. So if I go back here to our user settings, user settings, you guys can see in here, if I go to user interface, I can actually set it so that we are using centimeters by default. If it's your first time opening Marvelous Designer, I implore you to take a look at this because it's very likely that this will be set to millimeters by default. And that will be a big problem. So please set this over to centimeters. If you know what you're doing and you prefer to work with millimeters, all the power to you, really. But if you've never touched this before, and especially if you want to follow the classes that we have on Outgang.studio and to using Marvelous Designer, I implore you to swap this over to centimeters and to always use centimeters going forward when importing things, and to pay attention to that when you are importing things inside of Marvelous Designer. So once again, File, Import, OBJ. We select our generic avatar. We use the default options here, but we do make sure that we are set to scale in centimeters. All right, so we have our avatar here. I can select it. If I select it in my 3D window, in my property editor, as you can imagine, I can now switch a lot of properties. I can change a lot of properties related to it. I could swap the color here as a little color swatch. Could change the color here to something else if I wanted to for the base body itself. But that's pretty much it. Beyond that, this is a static body. There's really nothing else we can do with it. But we can start to build clothes around that. Now, this is the first of two ways that you can load an avatar inside of Marvelous Designer. With every version of Marvelous Designer, they released new avatars and the quality of the default avatars that come with the software has been increasing pretty much with every version. And they have some pretty good base bodies in there right now. It didn't used to be like that, but now they have some base bodies that are actually pretty solid. And we could also explore those as default. In fact, I will show you guys a few things that are actually quite interesting with that. And so right to the left of your 3D window, there's a little toolbar here. It's very hard to see. It's super hidden there, but right on the edge here, so on the leftmost of the screen, really, you can see there's 3 buttons here that are written vertically. So we have library, history, and modular configurator. Let's click on library and see what's in there. So let's click on that. If I click on that, you guys will have access through that to the default library of either garments, avatars, or other things that come with Marvelous Designer. And there's some pretty good stuff in there. It's worth to explore that a little bit. So first of all, of course, we can go to avatar. And so if I click on that, you guys can see that there are different folders here that get displayed. My recommendation is to stick to the V2 ones, so either female V2 or male V2. If you're working on a stylized character, I suppose you could explore that, but thing with stylized characters is that the proportion changes so much that it's probably unlikely that this is really something that you need. But so male V2 and female V2, those are actually the higher quality ones really that we have in there. So let's look for male then. If I open this folder, what is in here? A whole bunch of stuff. Probably the most important ones to begin with are these 2 ones here. So that are essentially .avt, as you can see. They're pretty much the same character in the sense that pretty much the only thing that changes is the head, really. The proportions are exactly the same. The base body is exactly the same. So feel free to select whichever one you want. It really doesn't make a difference there. So I simply have to double click on one of these and it will load that default avatar within the scene. So you have male and female one that you can load within your scene to use as a starting point. These are of a higher, well, no, they're not necessarily high quality than if you were to create one yourself, but they're more complete. Let's just put it that way. Like, they're actually already rigged and you can animate them and stuff like that, which we'll talk about a little bit, but not too much. But I do want to show you just a few quick things there. So if you're completely new to Marvelous Designer and if you don't have a lot of experience sculpting things either, this is very likely where you should start. And something we won't really explore right now, but I just want you guys to know about this, all right? This is a new feature of Marvelous Designer 10, if I remember that correctly. If we go into our menus on top, there is actually something here called Avatar Editor. We could actually open that and we could start to change all the measurements that we have on this particular character. So if we do have very specific measurements, this is a great way for you guys to go in here and start to change stuff. And as you can see, you can actually kind of change the morphology of your character just by changing these values. Can make some very interesting things like these. Everyone needs to have a character with a enlarged thyroid gland. That's a joke, of course. But yeah, so I don't want to talk about this more, but I just want you guys to be aware of that. And if you guys are interested in maybe changing the default measurements on the avatar, this is essentially where you would go and you would do that. So that is one of the advantages of using the default avatars, perhaps. And if you're certainly new, I think that this is a better starting point than trying to make your own. Okay, so what else do we have in there? Well, you could swap the haircut. You could do stuff like that. Largely, these really don't matter all that much. But one thing that is interesting, though, at this point to talk about is the pose of the character. So if you create your avatar inside a ZBrush or you load something, you've bought an avatar, you've bought a scan of a body, something like that. Your character will have to have been rigged, will have to have been skinned if you want to be able to pose a character in different ways. That whole workflow is actually talked about and described. We don't talk about rigging specifically, but I do show you guys how to animate an avatar like this during the classes there. So I think it's the class on garment fitting and iterating, I believe. We talk about that. but it's not something we'll talk about right now in the context of custom avatars. It's not something we'll talk about today. But what I do want to point out, though, for you guys is that inside these default folders, there is something here called pose that you can see. There's a folder called pose. You could actually go in here and say like, okay, so what happens if I click on this then? So, okay, there's a pose here, kind of looks like this. What happens if I select that? This happens. Your character will simply change pose to having the arms brought down and be next to the body there. And so you can actually go through some of these different poses like that for your avatar. Now, it happens that there actually is only 2 default poses inside of Marvelous Designer. This is super weird. Marvelous Designer actually comes with 2 poses, which is this one and this one. It's these 2 that are here, actually. And you can see that in both cases, the arms are brought down, which is useful to have the arms brought down like that. But it's probably not how we want to be editing most of our requirements, really. So this is actually a bit of a problem, that it actually only comes with these 2 because you need to have a pose. You need to be able to go back to this particular pose. But what I'm saying is that this pose isn't here by default. This is something I've actually added myself. And if we go here in the females, actually, you'll see what I'm talking about. So if I go here, so I'm back in Avatar here, I go to Female V2, I go to Pose. Well, actually, it's completely empty for females, it seems. So that's even more of a problem, right? So at least we have something for males, but we don't have anything for females. That kind of sucks. But what I've done here, this is actually very simple, and you will simplify your life a lot if you do this here. So if you are using the male avatar, what I highly recommend is that the first time that you go to the pose folder right here, the first time that you go in this folder right here, after you have loaded the avatar within your scene, of course, if you haven't done that yet, then that's kind of useless. So just double click on this to have the character in your scene. Go to pose. And what I think that you guys should really do is go to file afterward, and go to save as, and we will simply save the current pose within this particular folder so that we can have access to the A pose. So we go to save as, and we simply save a pose. And by default, it's going to open the proper folder here, so you shouldn't have to look for it. It's going to simply open. If I delete this here, which was the one that I had created, although it's not going to refresh it here, it's going to open the folder in which you are right now. And here you can simply write this. This is actually an A pose, so let's write this as A pose. And just save it in there. And so it won't refresh here, unfortunately. Although if you do press this, it will. And you can see now that this pose is now here, which allows me to simply go back and forth between these 2 poses, as you can see. Now, why is that important? I'll show you guys why that's important in just a minute. I will show you guys why that is important. But before I do that, before I show you guys why that's important, I want to talk a little bit more about what is in this library that we have. So if I close the library and we go back to the default state at which we were, this pretty much looked like that, right? We had our avatar in our 3D window that is kind of like this. But what else is there in our library? Or rather, in this toolbar, what else is there? There's this third option here, which is called Modular Configurator, which sounds a bit like a mouthful. Like, oh, what the hell is that, Modular Configurator? Let's open it and let's look what's in there. This is super, super interesting, by the way. You open here the Modular Configurator, and pretty much looks like this. You get 3 folders. And what I would suggest in this case, since we have a male avatar in the scene, let's go to Man. And let's look what's in there. Man. Ooh, this is interesting. Jackets, polos, shirts, t-shirts, trench coats. Are there default? Is there default data that we can use on our character? The answer is yes. There is default data. Why don't we go to jacket here, and why don't we open that and see what's in there? Ooh, this is interesting. So we have a chance between a double-breasted jacket or a simple single-breasted jacket. Okay, let's take double-breasted. I don't particularly have any attachment to it, but let's just take that. What happens if I click on this? Okay, more options. Have you ever configured a default character inside of a video game? So it's kind of like that, really. Let's select first what kind of torso piece we want. I want this one. Let's just click on that. Boom, there you go. Whoa, okay. Something just happened on my character. That's kind of cool. All right, so what's this then? These are, if I select this here, what's going to happen? Boom, there you go. Now we get a back attached to our character. Pretty cool. Okay, so I suspect that this is for sleeves, right? And you would be completely right. But this is a bit of a problem, right? Like, it doesn't really quite fit on the character. It's like, well, is this really meant for that? The answer is yes, it's meant for it, but it's meant for a avatar in a default pose. Okay. So let's erase our garment. And okay, so let's go back to our library. Let's go back to our avatar. Let's go to our male V2. We are already in here, I believe. So now let's go to our pose and let's select our default pose of the male with the arms down. Let's click on that. Here we go. Now we have our arms down. Will that now suddenly match? Well, the answer is yes. So I'll spoil the fun right now. Let's go to shirt then. So now I'm back in my modular configurator. Let's go to shirts. Let's see what's in there. This one's interesting. Let's go for a basic shirt. And more options now. This is kind of getting interesting. Okay, let's say we want this front. Let's say we want that front. Or why not this one? All right, let's try this one. Cool. All right. What about the back? Which back do we want? I want this one. Nice. Look at that. We can choose a collar. It's fantastic. How about this one? Pretty nice. Pretty nice. All right. What about this for the sleeves? And what about this for the cuffs? There you go. You've completely dressed your first character. Okay. But this isn't a really good pose to work off of, though, right? Because the arms are too far down. Like, this is a natural pose for the character to be wearing a garment, but it's not a natural pose to be working on a garment. And there's a lot of reasons for that. First is that having the arms so close to the body will create a lot of interpenetration problems, potential interpenetration problems, which is one of the challenges of doing Marvelous Designer, is that we always constantly have to deal with interpenetration and the issues related to that. So yeah, it's kind of always a bit of a problem that we have to deal with. So having the arms too close to the body is a great way to have a lot of issues later on when simulating, especially if you're using GPU mode. So my recommendation is that you switch the pose back to that pose that we have saved previously. So how do we do that? Simply click on the pose once more, right? Click on that, click OK, and let's see what's going to happen. Ain't that nice? Our character has raised his arms so that now the arms of the character are placed exactly in a pretty nice A pose that we can really use to work. And that's really fantastic. Cool. Okay. It's pretty solid. All right. So this is a pretty good starting point. Like, if you haven't ever constructed garments before, I highly recommend that you go through the modular configurator and just try putting together a few garments with that, because what it's going to do, it's going to give you a great representation afterward in the 2D window of what panels do you need to be able to create such a garment. So studying this is really awesome. It's a really, really awesome thing to do. Very, very, very good.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go for it. All right. First question.
Sorry. How we can manage the simulation? Can go back and forth, having a timeline. I don't know how does that work.
Ooh, that's a great question. Yeah, okay, so one thing I haven't talked about, we won't really cover it in detail today, but I will at least show you guys where it is. if you go here on the top right of the screen, so Soren, if you go here on the top right corner of the screen, there's something here that says simulation. You can actually click on this little drop down here, and this will allow you to swap the just the full interface into different modes of Mars Designer. And one of the things that you can swap to is the animation tab here. Now, you can't really animate within Mars Designer though. But if you were to load an animation externally, you would be able to see the different animations in here. In our case today, there's not much that we can do with this, but you were looking for a timeline, and this is where you're going to find it. But as you can see, even swapping the pose, it doesn't really give me much into the timeline there. And you can't animate anything directly in here. You can only load external animations. So the usage of this timeline is extremely, extremely limited. But there are cases where it's useful.
Okay, can we go back to the beginning of the simulation, maybe?
Let's do it, yeah. Well, I mean, the only way I could go back here is just by swapping the pose, really.
I have a question as well, when it's possible.
Yeah, go for it.
Imagine that you have your own base mesh and you want to use the library.
Yeah.
Okay. Makes sense to import this avatar to ZBrush and match your base mesh to this one, and then using the morph target to swap it. Is the right workflow? You know what I mean?
Well, if you have your own base body, the workflow becomes a lot more complicated to load animations. There's a few different ways that you can do it. The garment fitting and iterating class actually covers that in great detail. So I would invite you guys to check that one out if you want to hear more about how do you animate a custom avatar, because I do talk about that in there. So that's probably the best answer I can give you right now. Just go ahead and watch that class because I do talk about that. You can't use the default poses, of course, that come with Mars Designer if you are using your own custom avatar. But the process there is mostly, well, you have to rig your own. There's really two choices. One is that you either rig your own base body, and you load it as an avatar in here, and in which case you can create separate pose files, since that character will have been rigged. One of the things that people don't necessarily know about Mars Designer, if you press Shift X here, you guys can actually see that here. Sorry, let me just swap Shift X here. If you actually press Shift X, you can actually select the bones directly. And I could actually move the arms of my character like this. So first of all, I could actually, so I'm sort of answering your question and like a lot more. So I'll get back to the exact answer that you are looking for here, but I'll explain other stuff at the same time. You know, one thing I could actually do that's kind of interesting, if I turn on a simulation here, especially GPU simulation, and while this is turned on and I press Shift X, I can now select the bones that I have if this character has been rigged. And I actually move the bones and I can move the garment in real time like that. And if you do it very slowly, you can actually change the pose and have the garment follow the pose that you are doing there. So that's an interesting manipulation. If you're using a custom base body that you have rigged and skinned, this will work just the same. So that's, first of all, like one of the options that you have when posing a custom base body, and maybe you want to create a few different pose files. But also to answer the question, which is, let's say that you start with one of these basic garments that is within Mars Designer. I think that was a question that you've asked. If you start one of these basic...
My base question, it's just like, imagine that I just want to reuse the library. So my question is mainly like, can I load these garments to my avatar, my custom avatar in this pose? Because like you said, the library only works for this A pose, you know, straight A pose, you know?
Yeah. So, okay, here's what you can do. So when we say reuse the library... Sorry, go. when we're talking about animation in this case, or rather the reuse of the library, you can't reuse the poses within the library, but you can use these garments though. Which is, I believe, what the question that you are asking right now. So if you do want to use some of these garments on your own custom avatar, which I believe is what you're saying, they have added inside Mars Designer 10 a tool called AutoFit that will actually do a fairly decent job of allowing you to transfer a garment. So there's this tool now. Now, this also has been covered during the previous classes. So in the classes that talks about the usage of AutoFit is also garment fitting and iterating, which is actually kind of a class that is very relevant to what we're talking about right now to kind of extend the knowledge share. Let me just go into that and just double check that. Because you can actually do that. You can use one of these default things. So garment fitting and iterating. Let me just check here. So using MD10's AutoFit feature. And I would invite you guys to check this particular section of this particular class out to see how to use that. But the idea is that MD AutoFit, show you guys kind of the result of that. Marvelous Designer. This is something that I have added in the last version of Mars Designer, so you need Mars Designer 10 to be able to use that. But it essentially allows the transfer of garments and rescaling, because that is, of course, the most important thing. If you use a garment, like I could obviously go in here and just select the avatar itself, erase it, go in File, do an import, and then import a different avatar. I could definitely do that, right? Like this is very easy to do. I just do this here, and then boom, I have my avatar in here. But then the problem that you have is that the garment isn't properly fitted to that different character. So the big thing about taking one of these garments and swapping it over on a different avatar, the challenge is not necessarily to load a different avatar in the scene, because as you can see, it's very simple. You simply have to import it, really. But the problem is that now the garment doesn't fit to that other character. And if your proportions are highly different, then that's where you will start to have a lot of issues. But so in the last version of Mars Designer 10, they have added this tool called autofitting to be able to do that kind of transfer between a garment, between different avatars. So I invite you guys to check this part of the class out to see how to use it. It's very finicky. There are bugs. It doesn't always work. It worked like 80% of the time. It's going to do a pretty good job. And for the other 20%, there's going to be a lot of manual labor involved. But it's the best starting point that you have to fit a garment to a different character. All right. I've more or less lost track of things a little bit. Soren, did I also answer your question satisfactorily?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so let's continue then. Yeah, so we were talking about this. So in the context of learning the basics of Mars Designer, it's not important for you guys to worry about these different modes. All of these different modes, other than the simulation mode, it's very limited. It feels like they've kind of started, they were kind of interested in maybe expanding some of these things. If I go back to the animation tab here, like you can't keyframe animation. You can't do like I can't just take the arm of the character, move it in a different direction, keyframe that. It'd be great to be able to do that, but you can't do it. So, it feels like a first implementation of something that could be much more useful. But if you guys do want to load custom animations, you have to create an animation for your character in an external program and then bring it back in here. Yeah, so the modular configurator, perfect starting point if you guys want to learn how does 2D representation of a garment look like. For some of these like relatively basic garment types that we could expect to have. Here I am again, I'm in the wrong pose. Let me just go ahead. So yeah, I invite you guys to take some time to really study these things. Like a big thing about learning how to create garments is to simply look at how other garments have been constructed before, right? Like that's the best thing that you can really do. Like if you're kind of curious, you want to create your own garments, you should go ahead and you should certainly do that. But use these as references. Don't be afraid to study these things and see what does a proper 2D representation of a garment look like. And you won't find a better thing to study than this, because this gives you the exact representation of an exact 3D garment in 2D and vice versa, as opposed to simply Google random patterns that you could use, which are useful too, of course, but I would wager that this is a better starting point to kind of study stuff. Okay, so why don't we take a few minutes to create a very basic garment ourselves. We haven't talked about seams yet and stuff like that. So what happened if we wanted to create our own very basic garment and kind of disregard this starting point here that we have? What if we wanted to create our own? What would that look like? Let me go ahead here and load a different pose. Okay, so we've talked about H being the shortcut to create polygons, right? So I could go ahead here and create a bit of a cloth panel right here. I could actually move it around. And let's say that we wanted to dress this guy up with a potato sack or something, like one of the most basic kind of things that we could start with, right? So first of all, other than H to create a kind of freeform polygon, we have other shortcuts. We could press S on our keyboard to select the rectangle creation tool. And in fact, if I hold this down, you can see that we have a choice between H for polygon, S for rectangle, or E for ellipse. And so as we press S, we will simply create a rectangle. So I could go ahead here and create a rectangle here that will kind of more or less have the shape of the front of the character. I could now select this. I could press now A to go into selection mode in my 2D window. I could select this panel I have created on the front. I could do Control C and Control V to copy it on the back, or rather to create a second panel that will afterward go on the back of the character. Right, so here I am. I got two panels. Right now they are the same because I simply duplicated them. And now let's start to place those on the avatar itself. An interesting thing, any avatar that you load inside of Marvelous Designer will have something attached to it that we call arrangement points. Arrangement points can be displayed in the viewport if you simply press Shift F on your keyboard. Shift F, there you go. And now I see all these little, like, kind of weird looking large blue dots that kind of appear. And the thing about these arrangement points, what they are, is that they are simply a shortcut for you to use to be able to start to wrap different garments or different pieces of cloth around your character. They're pretty much just a shortcut. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean something like this here. If I select a panel of cloth in my 3D window, after I have pressed Shift F to turn on the arrangement points, you can see that afterward now, if I click somewhere, if I move my cursor over one of these arrangement points, let's say that I use this one here, it's going to wrap the panel of cloth that I had selected around the character. And I can continue to move them afterward. I can move them down and stuff like that. So these simply help start as a bit of a base there. I could take this here. I could do the same thing, click on the arrangement point on the back, move this here on the back, something like that. And now, let's say that we wanted to sew these things together so that they stay in place on the character. Let me press Shift F again to disable the arrangement points. And so if I start the simulation now, these two pieces of cloth, as you can imagine, they're just going to drop down on the floor and not going to do much. You know, they do collide with the avatar, of course, but they certainly do not hold in place. So for them to essentially stay in place on the avatar, they need to be sewn together, right? So we need to specify where we want these two different pieces of cloth to meet. And the way that we sew two things together, there's a few different options for that. It's all within the 2D window, of course. And the sewing buttons that you have are all the buttons that you have right here. It's all these here. But it's mostly these two here. So segment sewing or free sewing. So N or M as a shortcut will allow you to start to create sewing lines between different panels. So let me go ahead here and press N to select sewing or segment sewing. And you can see that on my cursor changes and I get this kind of cyan looking outline. If I press here from here to there, if I press between two edges of my different panels, I will create this kind of funky looking connection between the two panels that I had before. And this here is simply the display of the fact that now there is a seam here that is connecting these two different panels. Okay, what does that mean? Let's turn on simulation. Let's see what happens now that I have creating one sewing. What happens? There you go. This happens. Not looking all that hot, but what is looking is that at least we could see that our garment has literally closed itself on that sewing. So that's kind of what sewings do. It's a way to simply close different panels together. Now, there's obviously a bunch of problems in this case here, right? Like, first of all, there's a sewing line that is going right through the arm of the character. It's not all that great. How can we fix that? Well, we can fix that in a few different ways. One of the ways that we can fix that is by selecting the sewing that we have added. And we can select the sewing by pressing B on our keyboard. All right. If you haven't understood it so far, a lot of these icons are actually icons just to select a bunch of stuff, right? So A here, this little icon selects panels. Z, or this icon here, selects vertices or edges. And then B right here, pressing B or the little icon under this one here, select sewing lines. So every like potential selection you could do has a different icon, has a different shortcut. It's a bit of a mindfuck, but that's how it is. You'll develop muscle memory around these things rather quickly. So just remember what the shortcuts are. They're more important than always clicking on toolbars, of course. So B will select a sewing that has been created previously. And so what could I do with this particular sewing that is going through the shoulder right now? I could select it. I could actually click on the extremities, as you can see. And click on the extremities of the sewing line. And I can actually move the extremities down until my sewing line now is not interpenetrating through the arm directly. Okay, cool. So I could do the same thing maybe on the top, right? I could kind of do the same thing. I could press N, sew from here to there, just like that, have a sewing line that goes right across. But then I have a bit of a problem because now the head is now kind of going through, right? So, I could create my seam like that. I could press B. I could select my sewing afterward. I could move the points around. I could do like a whole bunch of stuff like that. But actually, at that point, wouldn't it be simpler if we could create it with the proper length to begin with, right from the start? The answer is yes. So that's what the M option does. So the N option creates sewing that take full edges. Whereas if you press M or the shortcut right next to it, you'll be able to create seams of a variable length. So I could start from this panel here from the top, make a little seam like that. And then this is one of those things that you can actually use the 3D window for, actually. So I could actually afterward here click, although sometimes it doesn't work all the back, right? So in this case here, let's just forget about it. So here, create a first part of my seam, and then afterward go on the opposite panel. You can see here when I'm creating my when my cursor is over an edge in my 2D window, I can see where the point is on the 3D panel afterwards. So I can kind of look at a 3D window to kind of see where my seam is going to end up, really. And I can create here an equivalent connection. Just like that. Also, something interesting. After you have created a seam, it will happen often that your seam will actually kind of look like this, where you've actually there's like kind of a twist that's been built in because it hadn't been created here exactly properly. this kind of thing will happen on a regular basis. If you see something like that, you can actually untwist your seam by pressing Control B on your keyboard. If I do that, you can see that it's simply continuously just kind of twisting or untwisting this particular seam. So just remember that if your seam comes out twisted, you can press Control B to untwist it. Okay, so what happens if I simulate now? All right, okay. I'm starting to get somewhere, right? Like we're starting to close something up. So, okay, why don't I kind of, if I were to, let's say, complete this potato sack over the character. Oh, see here? This one is actually twisted. Let me press Control B to untwist it. There you go. We have an extremely basic and certainly ill-fitting shirt that is kind of created. But pretty much, like, you could actually do a whole lot of stuff using just what we've seen so far. Like, I could actually now add a bunch of points here. I could move a point down like this. I could start to form a collar here on the front. I could add points here. So I'm pressing X to go in point add mode. And I could add a bunch of points to the back. I could add a point like this, you know. I could certainly start to, like, slowly shape this into a better looking garment, of course. We could certainly do that, you know. But there are other more important or more interesting options also to help us shape these panels into something really nice that we will talk about after the break is done. So after the break is done, we'll simply continue working on this. We'll continue working on this and we'll try our hand at building an actual garment from scratch with this, building an actual shirt from scratch. And I'll show you guys a whole lot of really cool functions inside the software that you can use to really make these basic garments. All right, guys, let's take a break. It is 52 right now. We're a few minutes behind schedule. Let's take a break until 2:05. So let's take a 13-minute break, guys. And yeah, that's it. So enjoy your break. I will see you guys at 5 minutes past 2 p.m. All right, everyone, let's continue then. So yeah, what we'll do for the second part of the class really is just to go through a whole bunch of different options that are you guys essentially need to know. So just the essential knowledge that you need to know to be able to construct simple garments inside of Marvelous Designer. So let's do that. Let's continue where we were right before the break. Before I talk about other options, let's talk simply and briefly about saving stuff, because there's a lot of saving options inside of Marvelous Designer. So I want to make sure that you guys know to use which ones in which context and that you're comfortable with that, of course. So first of all, if we go to save here, and I'm like, okay, I kind of want to save this here. So a save project will save everything that you have within your scene. So if you're not sure which saving option to use, just use this one. And it's going to select everything into a nice little ZPR file, which I keep thinking is a ZBrush file. I still don't know what the Z means in this case. But it certainly sounds like, oh, that's a ZBrush project file. It's like, nope, it's Marvelous Designer file. You know, it's ZPRJ. So if in doubt, simply use save project to save your stuff, because that will save everything you have within your scene. But it's good to know that if you go to save as here, there is, as you can see, a whole slew of saving options. You know, we saved a pose before. We could have saved an avatar. If we save an avatar, it's going to save the character without any clothes. So even if you have clothes in your scene, saving only the avatar will save only the base body there. Hair, shoes is kind of like an extension of the avatar. It doesn't really matter for us. We said pose. Joint motion is in case we have a pose that is saved as, well, the name is self-explanatory, but that's beyond the scope of this class today. And garment is the opposite of an avatar. So if the avatar is only the base body, if you save a garment, you are saving only the clothes and no base body in there. And that's useful because if you go to open or add, you'll see that pretty much all these options are in there as well. This all gets very confusing, unfortunately. But just remember that save project is really your go-to saving option if in doubt. And even if you save something as a project, you could actually, in another context, go to open and open a project. Let's say that I do select open project here. And I load, I don't know, this one here. That's just a random one. And when I go to File, Open, you can see that I can either open the garment or the avatar or both at the same time. So a project contains both the garment and the avatar within the same scene. But even here, we could decide that we only want to load in, let's say, the garment and not the avatar. So if I do that here, I only select garment and load type. This will either completely replace what is in your scene right now, which is open, or you could add it to the scene and keep whatever is in there right now, right? So if I do open a project, I say add garment, I will import in this particular scene the garment without loading in the avatar and without replacing the content of this particular scene. So these are your different options to save and to load things. As far as exporting is concerned, if you want to export something out, you're done with a garment. Just keep in mind that the vertices that will be on the mesh that you will export are pretty much exactly the same vertices that you have when you press Alt 5 on your keyboard there. It's pretty much the same vertices that you see here, right? So if I take a mesh here at whichever particle distance I currently have, right now we are at 10. If I export this garment out, this is pretty much the exact geometry that I will get here. So why don't we do that just for the sake of it, right? If I were to go to File, Export, and in this case, let's just export OBJ. Let's export everything and we'll see what we get out of it, right? So here, Export OBJ, and I say, I don't know, test. Let me just write test down here. All right. What this is going to do, it's going to open this export OBJ window where you can select a whole bunch of options. So just like for saving and importing stuff, you can, when you're working with Z Project data, you could manipulate only the patterns, only the avatars, or both, So of course, if I turn off avatar in this case, I will only be exporting the cloth and nothing else. And in here, for today, it's not worth to delve too much into this. But depending where you will throw your garment afterward, whether you want to do a retopology for it, or whether you just want to have the raw data within ZBrush after the fact, you would use the different combinations of these different options. And I resume a lot of these different options and how to use these different options in the class on exporting out of Marvelous Designer and back to ZBrush. So if we go back on Algang.studio right now, go back to the classes that we have. The class here that is called, let's go here. The class that is called Exporting Out of Marvelous Designer will explain in greater detail the different options that we have in our export box and in which context to use them. So I invite you guys to check this out if you want to know what are the different export options and how to use them beyond the simple default ones, right? But at least if we simply complete this now, so we're exporting all patterns. In this case, let me export the avatar as well. Single object, unweld, thin, all these options are good as default. I want to simply make sure though that under basic scale, I am also set to centimeters here. That's kind of it. Once you click export, it's going to pretty much export your mesh as an OBJ, and which allows us afterward to go back in ZBrush. And simply go to import and import our test in here, which will give us our avatar and our garment. All right. So how do we improve this then? What else do we do? Well, let's continue with what we have. But for me, there's two things that really immediately jump up to me as things that we really need to talk about really, really soon, and like how to manipulate this, right? Like, first of all, it's going to become painfully obvious sooner or later that you need symmetry options in here to be able to work on a garment, because a lot of garments we'll create will be symmetrical, right? So first of all, if I'm in here and I'm like, okay, maybe the point of the shoulder is this here, maybe I would like to be this in a different position. I could obviously press D here to go into pattern selection mode or vertex selection mode. I could select the vertex here and I could move it in a different position, which will of course, rescale the garment. It will change a whole bunch of stuff inside our 3D viewport. But obviously, we want to be able to work on garments symmetrically as much as possible, right? So there's really two options at our disposal to symmetrize a garment. I don't know whether that's a word or not. If it's not, I'm making one up, but I think symmetrize is a word. I'm going to assume that it's a word. If we want to symmetrize this pattern, we pretty much have two options at our disposal. And here are what the two options are. So the first thing that I could do, first of all, I have to split this, right? I have to split this down the middle so that I can have a left part and a right part, and both can be symmetrical, but I need to specify in some shape, way, or form where is that symmetry line that I want, right? So the first thing that we need to do is to simply define where we want the symmetry to happen. In this case, I want the symmetry to happen at the middle part here. So, I could do a few things. I could, let's say, add a point here to the bottom by pressing X and adding a point. I could take these points here. I could erase them, and now I only have half of my garment. But yeah, is that really the best way to work? Well, not really. There's actually a better way that we can split this in half. What we'll do, we'll simply cut right down the middle of the garment. We'll cut through the garment using the midline of it. So a bit more complicated, but still not all that complex, really. So I want to cut from here all the way down to there where that point was, but let's say that point isn't even there to begin with. So how do I do that? Let's use what we call an internal line. So you've seen that if I press H, I can create a polygon. But what about creating shapes within shapes that already exist? If I press H here and I create a polygon here, it's just going to create a different panel, really. But what if I wanted to have a shape that is within a particular panel that I already have? That's where you need to start to introduce the notion of internal line. So right next to my polygon creation button right here, there's a button here that's called internal polygon line, and you can press G to access it. So G puts you in internal line creation mode, and you'll see that it's really, really simple. If I click on a vertex here that I have, and my cursor is going to snap to it, I can actually draw a line here. And while I'm drawing this line, in this particular case, if I hold down Shift, I'll be able to snap this line along 45-degree increments. And so I'm simply going to hold Shift, and I'm going to drag all the way down to the edge that is to the bottom of my shirt right here. And then I'm going to double click on the vertex that is at the extremity. And what we have done, we have created an internal line that goes all the way down the middle of the garment. As you can imagine, you can create internal lines just like you can create polygons. I could easily say, well, maybe I want to have like a pocket here or something. I could actually do an internal line like that and create the outline of a pocket, if you will, using that internal line. And then we could split that and do that, and we'll do that later a little bit. But so you can make any sort of shape using internal lines. And now that I have added an internal line right down the middle here, what I want is I want to cut along the internal line. I want to split the panel that I have here in two following this internal line. So I will simply press A to go into selection mode. In my 2D window, I will select my internal line, and then I will right-click on the internal line, and I will select Cut right here. So Cut or Control U. I'll be honest, I'm not completely sure whether that's a default shortcut or if I have applied that myself. But I do recommend U and Control U as shortcuts for these because it is quite useful, and I believe that they are free by default. So if ever you don't have a shortcut for Cut that is already defined, you can easily do one, of course, by going to Settings, User Settings. And like the beautiful thing about this too is that if I go here and I say, okay, what about Cut or Cut and Sew, right? If I go here, oh, sorry, let me just bring that back up. Cut and Sew. I could actually either delete the shortcut that is already there, or I could swap this over for something else. But if you do swap this over for a shortcut that already exists, you'll get a warning that Mars Designer is like, hey, this already exists somewhere else, right? So why is that useful? Because there's a whole bunch of keys that are not even used on your keyboard to begin with. So if there's a shortcut that you like to use for something and you're not sure whether that's used or not, Mars Designer will give you a warning if that shortcut is already used somewhere else, And then, what you do in that context usually is you go to shortcut key here, you type in Control U, and you check to see what that shortcut is attached to and whether that is something that maybe you want to replace or not, But I'm a big believer in customizing shortcuts. I think that's really, really important. Anyway, so selecting our internal line again, I'll do Control U to cut this up. Now, the cut and sew option is, the name is self-explanatory. It's just going to cut, but it's going to create a sewing line between two pieces that you have cut there. So either way really works, really. Okay, now that I have cut this up and now I wind up having two different panels with a sewing line that connects them, there's a few different things at my disposal. There's a few different options that I could use to symmetrize this. In this case, the simplest thing that I could do to symmetrize this is to take and select the two panels that I have here that I want to be symmetrical and right-click with those two panels selected and select the option here where it says here, apply linked editing. It's written super, super dark, all right? It's super hard to see, but there is under where it's written apply linked editing. You can see here it's something that says symmetric pattern with sewing. And don't get confused because you can see that that's in two different locations here. There are two options here called symmetric pattern with sewing, and they both do slightly different things. So if you already have panels that exist that you want to symmetrize, you select the two of them, right click, and then under apply linked editing, select symmetric pattern with sewing. Now, if your panels are too dissimilar, if they're too different, you're going to get a warning here. Mars Designer is going to be like, no, sorry, these two panels look a little too different. I can't symmetrize them, unfortunately, which unfortunately is the case here. And I believe I could probably fix that by just moving this point here a little too far, because there's a certain tolerance. If your points are too far from each other, you'll get this here. So let me try this again. Yeah, still doesn't work. But yeah, so this works often, but it won't always work because if your patterns are too dissimilar, I mean, they look visually the same, only being symmetrized, but I guess for Marvelous, this is still too far. So the other option that we have then is to delete one side, take the other side, right click on it. And now, once again, this is confusing, I know, but yeah, if you practice this, you'll get the hang of it really, really quickly. Again, under, but this time actually under clone pattern with linked sewing. It's written super dark, so it's possible you may not even see it. But if you just look for it on your side here, symmetric pattern with sewing. Same option, but in this case, it will also duplicate it. It's confusing. Just try it out and you'll get the hang of it pretty quickly. And now these two panels are symmetrical. And you know they're symmetrical because there's this little blue outline around your garment pieces that tells you that they are symmetrical. So if I press X again and I add a bunch of points here, you can see that the points get added and manipulated on both sides independently, or rather get manipulated on both sides at the same time. Okay, and the last way that I could symmetrize this, particular pattern is that, and this is a good option if you have something like a panel where there's a clear center line somewhere. You could use the final way to symmetrize a panel, which is to simply select an edge that will be in the midline of the final piece. So you select an edge somewhere, right click on it, and simply do unfold symmetric editing with sewing. And this will give you one panel but with this little pointed line running down the middle that tells you that it is indeed symmetrical. So a whole bunch of options to symmetrize something. I don't like to use the unfold option here too much. I'm more used, I guess this may be a personal preference. I don't have a huge reasons why, but I like to keep things separated. So I personally like, if I want to have a piece like this that is symmetrical, to simply take the piece, do a symmetric pattern on the other side, and work with this. I just like it. I can move these things independently. And once I'm done, once I'm happy, I could always sew these together. If I wanted to merge this all into one piece, I could actually select a sewing line that I have right here between my two panels that are symmetrical, but this works just as well if your panels are not symmetrical. Right-click on the sewing line, and once again, I have to press B to be able to go in sewing selection mode. Select a sewing line, right-click on it, and do a merge. And what this will do, it will simply merge your panels down where you had your sewing before. So you can easily cut and merge different patterns, which means that when you're creating something, you really don't have to be adamant about keeping it as one chunk, you know? Like there are cases where I'm like, okay, like maybe I just want to work on this little corner that's here, you know, this little thing that's there. And for some reason, I don't really want to work on the rest of the garment at the same time because maybe it's just too complicated for me. There's just too much stuff there. Like I often will do this trick here. I will press G. I will add an internal line somewhere. Maybe I'll just cut this off here. I'll do an internal line that starts from this point here, goes all the way down to the other edge. I will simply cut and sew it. You know, and then you can do any sort of manipulations you want to this. You know, I can add a bunch of points. I can do all sorts of stuff, you know. And once I'm happy with this, then I press B. I select the sewing line between the two of these. If the sewing line isn't there for some reason, you can recreate it, of course. Select the sewing line, right click, merge it. Now you're back having one big chunk, you know? So don't be afraid of doing that, of just cutting, sewing together stuff, you know? You can do it as much as you want. Okay. So where were we with this? So we had this that was split. Let's cut and sew this. Let me delete this side, select this side, do symmetric pattern with sewing on the other side. And there you go. It is now symmetrical. And let's do the same thing with the back then. My apply linked editing still won't work, so let's do it manual again. Let's duplicate this on the other side. There you go. Now here I simply want to select these, move them so that they're in a bit of a better location. And then let's complete the sewing where we need to have a sewing line. So I need a sewing line between these two symmetrical panels. There you go, that's done. These sewings are still there. This is still there, this is still there, this is good. And over the front too, I will sew these together. And let's simulate again. Okay. So what's happening with the sleeve here? Well, as you can see, I had added a bunch of points here, which has given me a different length between, let's say, the top edge. Let me just delete these points here. They're a bit, there's a bit too much there. So the theme that I had still has the same length as I had before. This was a theme that I had created before the break there. You know, if I take this here, so this is the back panel, you know, if I take it and I rotate it like that, and I move it here, you can see where the seam is right here that connects these two panels together right here. Let me move this out just like that. You guys can actually see that. Now, no one says that a seam has to be of an exact length on both sides. In a lot of cases, it's preferable to have a seam be the same length on both sides. right? But no one says that it absolutely has to be like that. What do I mean by that? Well, you can see here that if I press N to go into segment stewing, right? This is the mode where you can simply click on one edge and click on a second edge, and it's going to create a stewing between these two edges there. What happens is that if you create a seam like this between two edges, and this seam has a wildly different length on both sides, what Marvelous Designer will do, it will simply bunch up the longer side so that it matches the length that you have on the other side, which is akin to adding an elastic through a garment somewhere. Here's what I mean by that, right? So you can see here that this sewing line that I have is about 10 centimeters on one side. You can see the length that gets displayed here as I select it. And it's about 26 centimeters on the other side. That's a huge difference, right? And so if I start simulation, this is going to happen. And just so that we can better appreciate what is going on right now, let me change the color of my fabric here. If you want to change the color of something, these different panels, right? If I want to change the color of these different panels, you can't just select a panel and then change the color here. You can't do that. You have to find what is the fabric that is applied to it. The notion of fabric is within our object browser. We had seen that we can go through here. We can see everything that is within our scene, although in most cases, there's not much of a reason to go in here. But there are cases where it's worth to go into this kind of scene explorer there, right? But our second tab in our object browser is a tab called Fabric. And this is pretty much where you will control the fabric properties or the simulation properties for the different fabric panels that you have within your scene. So every panel that you have within your scene always has a particular fabric that is applied to it. You can't not have one. And so by default, things are simply having the default fabric one applied to it. And you can have multiple panels that share the same fabric. And in fact, by default, we have only one of them in the scene. It kind of looks like that. And all the panels are assigned the same fabric properties. So what does that mean? Well, if I select this fabric property right here, this little fabric one, I can see by going to the property editor, what is the color applied to it right now. And right now it's completely white. So let's swap that over to something that's a bit darker. It's going to be a bit easier to see. And this is also where you would go if you wanted to change your simulation properties, because there are default simulation properties that work pretty well when we are creating basic garments. But, sometimes we would like something to simulate more as leather, simulate more as wool, simulate more as cotton, these kind of things. And so these, it is possible to have our fabrics inherit more accurate, more precise simulation properties of different materials that we would have in real life by tweaking their properties in here under the physical property thing that is right here. We could do that. We won't do that today. We do that during the classes, so I do invite you guys to check that out. Check out the other classes, of course, if you are interested in exploring this more, but this isn't something we'll talk about beyond today, essentially. But I just want you guys to be aware, to know that this is there and that this is where you would change that. Okay. So, yeah, you guys can see the kind of bunching up that is kind of starting to happen here, almost as if there was an elastic here, because we are using wildly different sewing lengths on both sides. Maybe gray isn't the best color. Let me use something that's a bit more colorful. But another thing that's interesting is that we can see that there's a bunch of folds here, right? But they're not all that easy to see. It's like they really don't look all that great right now. And when we rotate the camera, they're super low res, And the reason for that is simply because, well, our particle distance is simply too high right now to get some nice high resolution folds out of this, right? Which brings us back to that topic there, the topic of particle distance. The resolution of folds that you will get is obviously tied to the particle distance. So the lower is the particle distance. If I'm selecting, let's say, this particular panel here, the lower I put the particle distance value, let's say I put this in half the value that it was at a value of 5, and I simulate again. The lower the particle distance, the nicer your folds are going to look because they will have more vertices to help define their shape. But then, as you can imagine, lower particle distance means that your performance would also be lower. So that's kind of the dance that you're always kind of playing when you're doing garments. You're kind of always tweaking this particle distance value so that it's not too low that your computer grinds to a halt every time you turn on simulation, but that it's also not too high that you can't see any details at all, right? We put, let's say, this value at like 20, which I actually believe is the default inside of Mars Designer. Now all these folds are completely gone, right? So super fast, great performance, but this is simply too high of a particle distance for me to be able to really appreciate well the folds that are getting created. Like, look at the distance here. They're all 2 centimeters apart. They're way too far, So you have to continuously, like, as you are refining garments, like this is similar to, I want you guys to think about this like you think about the Dynamesh value inside of ZBrush. If you guys are familiar with that notion. When you start in ZBrush and you start sculpting something, like we always say to people, keep a Dynamesh resolution low when you start sculpting something so that you are forced to concentrate on the higher shapes, on the bigger shapes, and you don't have enough resolution to do the details. It's the same thing inside of Mars Designer. When you start with a garment inside Mars Designer, keep your particle distance relatively high so that you get great performance and you can worry about the overall very general shape of your garment. And then as you refine the shapes as it goes on, then you want to gradually lower the particle distance on your different garment pieces so that you gradually increase the resolution of the mesh so that you get more and more details that are expressed at the cost of performance, So that's kind of the dance that you're playing when you're working with garments. You're always kind of trying to sort of judge and find what is the most appropriate particle distance. Now, one of the things we won't have time, like you can see now, like particle distance 5, just how slower this is. But if I really want to have a nice display about what's happening here, it's kind of what I have to do. Now, there is other ways to increase performance inside of Mars Designer. You can also do things like deactivating panels so that they don't get simulated. I can deactivate this here. Now my performance will go a lot higher than what it was before, because now this panel, which was very costly in terms of performance, is now disabled. So we can disable panels. You can do that using Control-J as a shortcut. Or you could also freeze panels. But freezing will not liberate the performance cost. It will cost as much, but at least your panels will stay completely static. Anyway, I don't want to talk more about freezing and deactivating in this context because although these things are highly important, I also talk about them during the classes. So I don't want to talk about them more today. Because the knowledge is already there. But I have also produced a very nifty video. It's not a very popular YouTube video because the topic isn't popular, but it's very informative, which is the important thing here. So if we go to our YouTube page, I invite you guys to check out the video in here that is called Understanding Freezing and Deactivating. You'll see it's not an exciting topic, but you have to know this. So if you don't know how to use these things, you really should look at this video as an extension of the knowledge that you're acquiring today. Because although the knowledge isn't the most exciting thing, it is certainly essential. Okay, so let's unfreeze this. Right, so getting back to the topic here. So seams can be of any length, really, And so if I was using the free segment sewing here instead, I could also make this seam of the exact same length. In fact, there's even a little dot that appears here that you can kind of snap to if you want to have a seam that is of the exact length. And in that case, we won't have this kind of elasticy kind of look. We'll have something that will get merged, essentially more or less flat. And again, this works symmetrically because of our symmetry on these garment pieces. Okay. Let me rotate this back to how it was. This was like this. This was in the middle. This was the front portion. Let me erase the seam. In fact, let me just undo a lot of what I've done here. Okay, so we're here and we're like, all right, let's continue this particular shirt. How do we continue? Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Well, the next thing that we'll need to understand to continue working on this properly is how to get some curvy effects on some of these different edges. Like so far, we've pretty much just created hard points when adding points using X as a shortcut. But so could you have curvier points? Like, could you have curvy points instead? Certainly, and certainly do that. Let's press C on our keyboard, which will put us in curvature mode. As you can see, all these different options are actually all stacked within this little drop down here. So either the Z option or C or V and X. Well, X is already there. V, we haven't talked about it, but we will in just a second. C and V as shortcuts will allow you to define curvy segments or curvy edges, if you will. So by pressing C and simply clicking on an edge somewhere, I can make a curve. And I can do the exact same thing on the back. Look at that, super simple, right? And now we suddenly have a curvy opening to our shirt. Super, super simple. Yeah, so this works across the board. Like we could curve anything really. Could start to create our what we call the arm side, which is a technical term for the just for the arm opening. Could start to create our arm side by, let's say, taking this point here, moving it outward like that a little bit, which will give us just a bit more ampleness or fullness to the front panels, and then pressing C and simply curving this sort of like that. And we can do the same on the back. Let's add a point about here. Let's move it outward. Let's press C and let's create our curvy arm side. And what will this look like once we simulate again? All right, as you guys could see, there was quite a lot of interpenetration there between my two different panels because as I'm manipulating them, as I'm stretching them and stuff, Marvelous Designer will obviously have to make that geometry appear in the 3D window somehow. And it often does so with interpenetrations as a byproduct. So the great thing about staying in CPU mode, like if I was actually in GPU mode, I would not be able to resolve this. If I start simulation here, you'll see that this will just stay like that. It's super fast, right? Because we're in GPU mode right now. But there's no way to solve this kind of thing because there simply is too much precision lacking when we're simulating in GPU mode to be able to solve problems like these. So that's why I like to work in CPU mode most of the time. And then even if I have something that interpenetrates like this in a way that's pretty ugly, I can still turn on simulation. Sorry, I'm still in GPU mode. Let me swap over to CPU mode. I can still simulate this, and although it is much slower and at start it looks like it's kind of getting worse. Truth be told, if we just wait here for just a minute, it's not going to take a minute, it's just going to take a few seconds. as you can see, Marvelous Designer will do a pretty good job at solving these interpenetrations that we had before. So in a lot of cases, you don't have to worry too much about the interpenetration issues that we had before. Because simulating in CPU mode is a very good way to solve these. All right, so it's slowly starting to take shape. There's obviously a bunch of stuff here that we need to address. It's not a well-fitted shirt, of course, and we are lacking sleeves entirely. So before we add sleeves in here, let's at least try and make this whole part here just a bit better. Let's try and make it read a bit better there. Okay, so what are we missing? Why is it looking so ugly? Well, there's a few reasons, right? First of all, the length here is probably too long. You know, you can see how it's sort of drooping down shoulder here. If I press Alt 4 to go in transparent mode, we can see more or less where the acromion is. And where the acromion is, now that's the technical term for the point of the shoulders, if you will, since there's a bony landmark in there called the acromion. If that's too technical, just think about the place where there's an angle change happening on the arm. And the angle change is happening about here, right? So this is more or less where our acromion is. And so I probably want to have this, if I want to make like a very well-fitted shirt, I would probably want to shorten this down a little bit. So let's do that. Let's take this here. Let's address this so that this becomes a lot shorter. Let's bring that inward, perhaps even more. Yeah, about like that. It's fine if it's not precisely on the acromion, of course. And now I have to do the same thing on the back. Now, I don't like to be overly precise, you know? Like, if I select this here, this is, you guys can kind of see here, it's written super tiny, but at least when you select an edge, the length of it is written down. This is 9.28 right now. Now, I could go here, I could select this edge right here. I could select it, and I could right-click on it and say, I want to change the length of this edge here. I could do that, and there are cases where this is certainly a very good thing to do. You select an edge, you right-click on it, you say you want to change the length of it. And then you simply afterward, with this dialog box, write down the exact length that you want it to have. So here we said 9.28. So I could certainly do this, and then I could say, okay, direction, I want it to grow from both ends, you know? I could do that, click OK. And now my edge here is exactly the same length as its matching edge on this other panel. But I don't like to do that because, you know, if you imagine patterns in real life, like people who do sewing and cut patterns and stuff like that, and, you know, putting aside garments that are machined and created using very precise machines there's always a slight amount of imprecision that is left over from like cutting panels. You know, you'll wind up things that are a few millimeters longer somewhere, a few millimeters shorter, you know. And I like to kind of, like, for me, that gives us a bit of a freedom. It kind of gives us a bit of a freedom to have lengths here that are slightly off, you know? So the point that I'm making is that, you know, don't kill yourself trying to make edges that are exactly the same length. Like, it's fine if you're like, okay, this should be about 9.3, you know? So I'll just do that here. And, you know, there you go. It's 9.4. It's great. It's fine. Those few millimeters won't change much, really. And now let's simulate again, and now we'll get here a pretty nice seam. Okay. What about the collar? I think the collar is too big right now, or the opening for the collar is too big. Let's shorten this down. And now here, if I want to edit the curvature of this again, right, I can again press C and then press on my edge. And I can continuously edit the curvature. So if the curvature isn't quite what I would like it, maybe I'd like something maybe more like this. There you go. Something more like that. There you go. I can create whichever curvature that I want with this. Okay, let's do the same edit on the back. Let's move this further inward. So it's kind of matching the same position. As you can see, if I have sometimes you'll have Bezier points that will show up, which you can manipulate the handles directly, especially if you have added curvature using the C button that I have shown you. And yeah, so, like basic manipulations, aren't all that complicated. Truth be told, with everything you've seen so far, you could actually model almost anything, really. You could actually model a whole lot of stuff with everything we've seen so far. And we really haven't even seen much, but so far we have seen really the core, right? But okay, let's continue working on this. We're not done with this yet. Okay, first of all, let's make the bottom of the shirt to be of a relatively equal width as the top, so that the shirt kind of drops down more or less straight and doesn't start to fit itself to the waist too much. Lots of interpenetrations, but we can just wait around. You can also pull sometimes. It helps to just yank on this fabric a little bit. It helps to fix interpenetrations a bit faster there. But yeah, you could work a lot cleaner, but I often don't really see too much to point in there. I'd rather just let it simulate for just a minute until it looks really, really good than try and be a little too cute and moving panels out of the way to fix interpenetration, resimulating. Although there are cases where this is certainly very useful to do. All right, what's happening here? What's happening for our arm side? There's a lot of ugly stuff that's kind of happening here. And I suspect that the reason why this is happening is probably because my seams are misaligned, So let's select this panel here. Let's select the panel on the back, this one here. Let's put them side by side so that we can analyze the seam between these two. And press B now to go in seam selection mode. And yeah, look at the seam. It's super uneven. It's not even connecting the proper points together. It's really not that great of a seam right now. So I could either manipulate it like this, and in fact, that is the simplest way we can do it right now. So let's just do that. There you go. It's going to help a lot. All right, our shirt is way too ample right now. It's much, much too ample right now. And I want to show you guys how to measure stuff so that you can start to build panels that are at a relatively sensible scale compared to the base body that you have. But before I do that, before I show this to you guys, I just want to talk a little bit more about curvature. Because there's a few options there I haven't shown you right now that are pretty important to know. You've seen when I press C on our keyboard, that we go into edit curvature mode, right? And we can take anything that is curvy and we can edit its curvature by just manipulating this. Or if something is straight, we can make it curvy, right? So all that is great. But what if I want to have something here that is a bit more complex than this? What if I want to have a shape that is just a weird shape, right? Because sometimes it's good to make weird shapes. We can't really do that with the while we're in C mode, while we're pressing C down. It's a little too simple as a tool for that. So in that case, what we have to do, if you want to have a curve, more control, more finer control over the curvature of something, we have to add what we call curvature points. There's two ways we can add curvature points. You've seen before that if I press X on my keyboard, I can add points, right? I can add vertices all over my surface. I can do that. But now these are hard points, right? But I can actually convert these hard points into curvy points, what we will call a curvature point. By selecting these hard points I have added over the surface right-clicking on them, and simply doing convert to curve point. Again, this shortcut is a shortcut I have applied myself. I can certainly recommend that you guys do the same. Convert to curve point, apply Shift D to it, works pretty well. But by default, I don't believe that there is a shortcut on this by default. So if I use this option now, convert to curve point, these points I have added now help to define this much more complex curvature to my surface. Okay, I obviously wouldn't want to have this here, but there's a lot of cases where this is very useful and very necessary. And so there's a few really interesting things about this. The first thing is that now that I have a bunch of curve points on this that I cannot see by default, if I press C again into my edit curvature mode, I can actually still adjust the curvature of this using that mode, which is really weird. But I can actually still manipulate this while I'm in C mode, while I'm in edit curvature mode, which sometimes is more intuitive to control your curves like that. Because the curve points that you have added, they simply get moved along the surface or the edge as you move it around. So first of all, that's really useful to know. But second of all, you could edit the curve points directly without using the C option by instead pressing V on your keyboard. So here I'll press V on my keyboard, which is the final option that we'll cover in this drop down here. V right here, edit curve point as opposed to edit curvature. I know all this gets confusing, but you have to try this out. And once you've done it a few times, you'll start to get the hang of it. V now, if I press V or if I just select this here, now I can actually select individual curve points that I have. And I can actually move them independently. So now I can make some very, very complex curves with this. All right. So I said that there were two ways to add these curve points. The first way to add these curve points is to simply use the add point tool, press X, add a few points, and then you select the points, you right click on them, and you convert them to curve point. That's the first way you can do it. The second way you can add curvature points, you go into V mode, so you press V, and then you quite simply click somewhere, which will add curvature points directly. So you can add as many of these as you want. Now, red on red isn't great, so let me change this color to something else. We'll be able to see the points a bit better. I mean, better. It should look a bit more obvious, right? So when you press V, those curvature points are displayed in orange color. And yeah, so you can continuously manipulate these. So it's kind of weird though, right? Because like here I had some Bezier curves. And you're like, well, what? There's Bezier curves here, but here's no Bezier curves. What's going on? Well, the reason, well, I mean, there is here, but there's no one here. By default, when you edit curvature of something, Marvelous Designer will create Bezier points. So if I take this straight edge here, I press C, I click on it, I drag it down, I press Z, I select this point here. Now you can see that I wind up having a Bezier point right here. But the moment that you add custom curvature points along the line, then you lose the Bezier handles that you had, and now you are simply in curvature mode, I suppose. So lastly, for curvature, if you want to straighten something out, there's a bunch of points that you have added. I've added a bunch of points here. I don't want to keep them. If I want to simply straighten this out, it's very simple. Simply select it, right click on it, delete all curve points. All right, that's all I wanted to say on curve points. Very useful, very powerful. You obviously have to play around with it a little bit so that you get familiar with it and you sort of understand the different subtleties between X, Z, V, C, all these things. I know it's quite a lot. I said that the UI is confusing, and unfortunately it is. I don't think it's as bad as ZBrush though, but it's its own beast, certainly, for sure. All right, let's go back to something a bit more It looks a little bit better than this. Yeah, so you can see I've swapped over to GPU so that I could settle this to something, I guess, more final, a bit faster there, but I won't be able to fix these interpenetrations like these. So sooner or later, I have to go back to CPU mode. Let's talk about measurements a little bit. And how do we measure things inside of Marvelous Designer? If you're like, okay, I want to make a shirt here that is relatively fitted to my character, how do I measure the length of the width of panel that I need and something like that? So there are quite a lot of different tapes that you can use in Marvelous Designer to measure things. And they all have the name of tape, really. So if you see tape in your UI somewhere, it's related to something that you can use to measure stuff. And it just so happens in our 3D toolbar that we have all the tape measurements we could ever need. So near the right part here of the toolbar, where it says Basic Tape Measure, as you can see, this is another one of those that if I hold the button down, I can actually select a whole bunch of different options for this. And these are all just different tapes that you can use to measure things a bit differently on your avatar. So let's start with the default one there, which is this one here. So Basic Tape Measure. Okay, interesting. What happens if I turn this on? Well, first our garment turns transparent so that we can click on the avatar directly. And this will simply allow us to do something like this here, Basic Tape Measure. That's weird. For some reason it's not working right now. And let's see if our tape measurements work right now. Oh yeah, there you go. See, okay, so there's something weird with all these different windows I have open. Hey, that's Marvelous Designer. It's a 3D software, and who says 3D software? It says something that is usually kind of bugged in different ways. Anyway, works here. Great. Awesome. All right, so edit tape measure. Yeah, so I can say here, this is the default one. This is the basic tape, which will simply allow me to say, okay, so how long is the shin bone? How long is the lower legs, let's say? Click here, click there. And then there you go. Now Marvelous Design tells you, this is from this point to that point, 45 centimeters exactly, right? So these are great to just help you out to measure things ahead of time. So once you have added a tape to your character, you can actually reselect the tape by clicking on Edit Measure, right? So if I press Q to go into the default selection mode, I cannot see the avatar tape there at all, but I can click on Edit Measure to be able to reselect this tape and look at its length once more. So there's a whole lot of different options in here. There's really 3 of those, really. So there's, although there are 6 options right now. So there's basic circumference and surface circumference. You guys could see something that was kind of weird, right? I kind of clicked from the knee all the way down to the ankle, and my line was actually kind of floating in midair. Now, this is actually very useful if you want to build a pant leg. But sometimes we actually want more precise. We want to have the actual surface length of something, which is, in which case we would use something like surface tape, which if I click over the same locations, will now give me the length, the surface length of the avatar. So they both have their reasons, you know, to exist. And there are cases where one is better. Generally, if you want to go for something that is skin tight, you would probably use this surface tape measure. If you want to create measurements for a garment that will be relatively loose, you probably want to privilege having the basic ones. And same thing here, we can also measure the circumference at the same time. So let's say I didn't have a waist tape that was already there. I could actually create one myself and measure what is the waist circumference, you know? Which is great if you want to, let's say, get this guy, I don't know, what could we do with this? Well, you guys could see how simple, like we could actually create, with everything we've said so far, we could easily create a very simple skirt here, right? If I just delete this here, let's say that we start with this particular avatar. Why don't we do that together, right? We're like, okay, so a skirt is something super, super basic, right? Let's just use a garment measurement here, or a basic circumference. Let's say, all right, I need a waistband, and my waistband needs to be about 60 centimeters. And yeah, so okay, why don't we do something like that then? Why don't we select our rectangle option, click on our 2D window, and in our create rectangle box here, let's say that we want this to be 60 centimeters by, let's say, 4 centimeters. And this gives us a piece of cloth that is perfect to fit around the waist of the character. We can press Shift F now to visualize our arrangement points. You will have these even if you're using a custom avatar. And I can take this waist band here and simply click on a corresponding arrangement point to start to place it around the waist. And now if I go down here in our property editor, while I have this waistband selected here, after I have connected it to an arrangement point, I can actually go down here and play with these different values here. And as you can see, as I play with the offset, you can see the kind of result that it gives me here. So I can kind of play with the offset until it's a bit closer to the body. Move the camera to look at the back. Create a sewing line to bridge the opening here. Start my simulation. And I have a perfectly fitting waistband. So if we wanted to maybe complete a skirt, like the simplest skirt I could do, like literally the simplest thing I could do is do something like this now. Oh, sorry. Let me take a rectangle. It's not going to be a pretty skirt, but it's going to work. I could make just a really big piece here. Really big rectangle. Let me scale it just a bit bigger. And then I could actually sew this to my waistband, just like that. Sew the opening on the back, take the panel, show my arrangement point, attach it to the arrangement point, play with the offset so that it's a bit bigger than this. Move this down. And I could actually make a very, very basic skirt like that. In fact, let me just go into GPU mode. And let me complete in CPU mode. Just to fix all this kind of interpenetration that is happening here on the waistband. And we can have a very basic skirt like this. Now you're like, but Laura, this doesn't look all that great. It's like the skirt is kind of going down. It's like, it's not connected. It's not staying in place. What if I want this waistband to always stay where it is? And I don't want it to go down. The great thing about avatar tapes is that you can actually use it as fashion tape. You can actually use avatar tapes to tape down part of your garment to the character. And that's a great tip to know. Because then it means that I can use, and the function to do that actually, so right next to avatar tape, if I hold the button down here, where it says edit measure avatar, there's actually this attach to measure button that is displayed there. If I select that, and I click on the top edge here of my waistband, and I click on the avatar tape afterward, now Marvelous Designer will tape down this particular edge to the avatar tape, and it will pretty much always stay there. No matter how much you pull on this, it will always stay pretty much at the exact same location. So you can make a very, very basic skirt like that. Now, as I said, basic because if we want to make a skirt that fits nicer, there's more in there. It's a bit more involved, though not necessarily all that complex. But you will find on Outgang.studio a whole lot of classes that is dedicated to that. In fact, there is one whose name is specifically how to create skirts. creating pleats, or actually, if you go in creating pleats and gathers, that's where we talk a lot about skirts, because the topic of pleats and gathers is very much related to skirt creation. So I invite you guys to check this out if you want to see more about how to create skirts using Mars Designer and how to take it from here, really. But yeah, so at its very basic, like you pretty much have all the knowledge you need right now to be able to create, to go from either very simple garments to very complex garments. I'm not quite done with this. I still want to cover a few different things here, because I find that our shirt is not really a shirt so far. So I do want to cover a few more things here, but for the most part, I don't have any more tools to introduce to you guys. That's kind of it. That's a lot so far, though, right? Like if you've never seen Marvelous Designer before, that's quite a lot to take in there. But that's why this is recorded and why you have obviously access to the class to be able to rewatch it again and again. Okay, but let's continue with this. I'm not done with this. I want to do a few more things to this before we call it a day. Okay, first of all, let's complete the sleeves, and let's attach the sleeves to the shirt opening, to the arm side. And let's try fitting this shirt to the garment, to the character a bit better here too. Okay, so first of all, let me get rid of these points. I don't need these points. Let's get rid of that. Let's just select them, delete them. Cool, okay. So my arm side right now is probably a little too big, right? I probably wouldn't expect my sleeves to be that small. So let's start by just adjusting that a little bit. And clearly too, like the shirt is way too baggy right now. So we definitely need to take this edge here and just bring it back in a little bit. Now, if I wanted to go and really measure this perfectly, really, right? Since I have 4 pieces of cloth and they're more or less all of equal length right now, I could easily just add an avatar tape, basic circumference measurement. Maybe let's say I go around the waist. Oh yeah, it's true. It doesn't work for some reason right now. But I could see in this different scene though that was working. We had something about like 77 centimeters or so, right? Okay, so let's go with the idea that I want to make a shirt that is 80 centimeters across. So I have 4 panels here, and I want something that is 80 centimeters of circumference. So each of these have to be 20 centimeters. It's very simple. So how long is it from here to there right now? How long is this right now? Well, there's a few different ways that we can measure it. But the way that I like to measure it, the way that I like the best is to simply use an internal line as a ruler, if you will. So as I press G here to go into internal line mode, you can see that I can click on both extremities here of this garment, and I can see the length of this internal line that is displayed at the same time. And the length right now is 33 centimeters. So we have like about like 13 centimeters or so of extra fabric that we need to get rid of. You know, so that's quite a lot. I probably don't want it to be like form-fitting 100%. So I'll try not to go down to 20, but maybe you could go down to maybe 25 or so. So why don't we do that? Why don't we go and have this be around 25 or so, maybe a bit more. There's no secrets here. I'll just take this edge and I'll just move it inward. And then I'll just use my internal line again and I'll measure this again. So here we're at about 26. I think that's pretty good. I'm happy with that. All right. Shoulders tend to like droop down like this a little bit within the pattern. So I'll just do that here. And now let's adjust the arm size so that it's a bit more, the curve is a bit more, I guess, something like that. Obviously, this is the time, you know, if you're going to go the way of creating your shirts from scratch, this is obviously the time when you want to start to bring out, you know, pattern references and stuff like that, right? Like shirt, pattern. I mean, that should be it, right? To like start to like really study these things, of course. You know, and start to look at like, okay, like how should an arm side kind of be shaped, usually stuff like that, you know, kind of want to start to pay attention to that. And you want to start to read into that a little bit. So we won't try to do any sort of like mathematically precise arm size and stuff. We won't do that today. So we'll just try to eyeball it today, right? So we've seen a shape that kind of looks like this. So I'm pretty satisfied with this. And now let's do the same thing on the other side. All right, how long is this? This is about 28. Yeah, I'm fine with that. I'm not trying to make the world's most fitted shirt here. My arm size probably looks pretty good. Kind of looking at the shape that I can see across a lot of these different references. Could probably go for something that's a bit more, it's a bit higher here, and maybe something like that. But yeah, for the most part, I think that's okay. This is too long though. Let's shorten it down so that the arm size is a bit shorter. All right, this looks pretty good to me. Oh, I haven't talked about this. If you want to hide something, just one panel, if you want to hide it, Shift Q will hide it. So I can hide a bunch of different panels like this. And if I want to bring back the visibility of everything, Shift W. All right, let's resimulate this, see what it's looking like. It's looking a lot better so far, right? It's already looking a lot better. And let's connect the sleeve to this then. I mean, we don't have a seam, but let's certainly go ahead and create one. I think this arm side could be a bit longer. This looks like it may start to get a bit uncomfortable, especially if the character was to raise their arms. So maybe we can give just a bit more leeway in here. And while we're there, why don't we adjust the curvature of this so that here we get a nice curvature that is continuous. We don't get a bit of a break here in terms of shape. So we'll probably have to adjust the curvature of this maybe a bit like this a little bit, right? Maybe even a bit on this side too, a little bit. So we get, we don't really see where is the point here. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. All right. This is more or less where the acromion is. It's looking pretty good too. Looking great, yeah. So I think this is all looking pretty good. So let's create the sleeve then. So sleeve, we need a cylinder. Now, if I want to be more precise with this, I could use an avatar tape. I could use here basic tape. Actually, let's go for a surface tape. I think it's going to be a bit more accurate in this case. I could use a surface tape. Oh no, it doesn't work. Oh God. Okay, let's use this one here. Let's use a surface tape then. Let's go. Okay, so about from here all the way down to the wrist, right? How much do we have? 55 centimeters, 54 centimeters, about 55. I'll go for 55. Quite happy with that. All right. Circumference then, what do we need? If we want it to be relatively form-fitting, perhaps, let's go for something, I don't know. Let's start by just using here a basic circumference. Okay. How wide is it at the wrist? It's about 17 centimeters. What about the elbow itself? About 26 centimeters. And here, well, it doesn't really matter because we have to connect this to the arm side. So we have 26 centimeters here. We have about 17 centimeters here. Okay, cool. That's pretty much all the information I need, really. So I can go in here and I could, let's just create a polygon directly as opposed to a rectangle and stuff. Let's just go. So here we need about, obviously it depends how much looseness I wanted here, right? So let's go for, I don't know, about 20 or so. And then we said about 55 that it needed to be, right? So about 55, yeah, something about like that. Something kind of like that. And now, do I have enough clearance for the elbow? How long is this right now? 28 or so. Yeah, that's kind of enough. But it's going to be pretty tight. So actually, maybe I would want to make the sleeve a bit wider then. Okay. And now let's wrap this on the arm itself. So for that, let's use our arrangement points once more. Shift F. There you go. But of course, the shape at the arm side, you know, this ain't going to work right now because this is just a cylinder and it's kind of running through the armpit right now. So yeah, there's stuff that's kind of missing here, right? Like we need to complexify this a bit more. Okay, so what did we do wrong? Well, what we did wrong is that we kind of measured the length on the front of the arm But what we should probably do instead is measure the length on the under the arm and then one length on top of the arm, and then use that to build our shape. Probably should have done that instead. So let's delete this tape. Let's create a new tape under the arm. Let's see how long this is. This is 49 centimeters right now, and one on top of the arm. In fact, I want to use a surface tape for this. So on top of the arm, from here, let's press here once so that we can account for the bend in the elbow. And then let's complete this line. 60 centimeters on top, pretty much perfectly. And we had about 50 under. All right, cool. Cool. Which means that if this vertex represents the height, the apex, if you will, of the arm side, it means that from here to there, I should have 60 centimeters. And I'm looking at it right now, I think it says about 66 or so. So let's chop off about 6 centimeters from this. And yeah, it's pretty good. And on the inside, we said about 50 centimeters. And now we're at 49. Let me just bring these points up just a little bit more. There you go. And now to complete the shape of the arm side, let's simply add a few points to kind of mimic the kind of shape that we can often see to it. You know, when you look at like the sleeve portion of like arm size, you always have this kind of weird curve to it. You know, it kind of looks like this a little bit, right? Well, let's just do something like that. Let's add 2 points. Let's move them. About like that or so. Let's select these 3 points, right click, convert to curve point. And maybe I can adjust the curvature of this a little bit. Maybe try and open up the curvature a bit more. And if I want finer control over this, as you no doubt know by now, press V and start to individually move these points. And I can even add a few if I feel that I don't have enough. All right, so for perfect connection, this edge here would be the exact same length this here. So this is 43 centimeters right now. This would be exactly the same length as is this plus this here. And if I add these two together, I'm getting a value here of 55 centimeters. That's pretty big. It's a pretty big difference. So 55 centimeters here, I'm simply looking at the value that is written down here, whereas here I have 43 centimeters. That's a problem, you know, like these two lengths should have to be the same, really. So this 43 length edge, curvy edge needs to be 55. Okay. Ooh, we need to make this a lot wider. Let's give that a try. So I guess I need something that's about like this here, then. It's going to be pretty loose sleeve, I feel like. Okay, let's move it down. If this is wrongly rotated, I could always play with the arrangement point. It still is connected to the arrangement point that it was before, which means that, as you can see, if I play around these values here, I can still actually rotate this, if you will. So I could rotate this until the seam is right under, just about like that or so. That should be pretty good. And finally, we have to sew all of it together. So I need to sew all the way around, which can be very complex if you don't know a proper tool to do that, or very simple if you know a good tool to do that. Let's use a tool here. We said that N allows us to create segment sewings, right? Now, if I try doing this right now, you can see the kind of result I'm going to get to this seam. It's really not going to work all that great. So if you want to connect like this, two edges on one edge, like if you want to connect a dissimilar amount of edges together using seams, what I like to use in this case is to hold down the button over the segment sewing button right here and select instead end-to-end segment sewing, this little thing here. And what this little button does, you can see that I've applied Shift-N as a shortcut to it. By default, I don't believe that's the case. It could be though. It could be, I'm not sure. But please do check on your site what the shortcut is if there even is one by default. What this allows you to do is to do something like this. First, you click on all the segments that you want to be on one side of the seam that you have. In this case, there's only one really. So I have to click on one, press Enter, and then I have to click on all the corresponding segments on the other side of the seam that I want to be connected to that. Which means in this case, it would be a simple, I'm probably going to do it wrong here, but maybe I'll get it right the first time, who knows. Which would be now this one here and then this one here. And then press Enter one last time. Oh, pretty much perfect. Oh no, I've actually inverted it. And what this does, that it will pretty much just distribute the proper length of seams that you need on both sides, so that you get the most perfect connection possible in this case. So let's redo it again. Let's select our end-to-end segment sewing. Let's say, okay, first let's start with this side here perhaps. So click once, click on a second segment, press Enter, and then connect that on the other side, on the other side of the seam. Select whichever edges will make up the other side of the seam and press Enter once more. And there you go. Perfect connection. And if I want this to be symmetrical, simply have to take the sleeve, right click, clone pattern, symmetric pattern with sewing. And here I'm simply going to move it at the proper location in the 3D window. And let's simulate. Oh, we did forget one seam, which is the seam right here. So let's connect that together. I'll be back in just 1 second. Did it explode? Oh no, it's actually not looking too bad. This kind of issue can easily be fixed just by yanking on the garment, really. This is why there's that yank thing when you are simulating. Just yank on stuff. There you go. Oh, let's yank on it a bit more. Let's yank until there is nothing left to yank on. Let's hold it down, and then let's release it. Oh, that's better, but we're still interpenetrating through the avatar. There you go. Problem fixed. There you go, guys. I think that pretty much wraps it up. It covers pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. I guess the last thing we've talked about perhaps a little too briefly was the topic of internal lines, and I talked about like the idea of like adding a shirt pocket. So why don't we do that? Let me take this here and add a shirt pocket to it. So let's say I want to have a shirt pocket, but only on one side of this shirt, right? And I don't want it to be symmetrical. because I don't want it to be symmetrical, it means that I need to break the symmetry between these two pieces. I cannot keep the symmetry there if I want to have a pocket only on one side. So at some point, you have to simply destroy the symmetry that you have created. So these two pieces are symmetrical right now, but I want to break the symmetry. So I will select one side, right click on it, and say that I want to remove linked editing. And by doing so, now my two pieces will be asymmetrical. Which means now I'm free to press G to go into internal line mode. Add something here that has the shape of a pocket. Just like that. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this whole panel here. I'm going to right click on it. And I'm going to do something here. I will do a layer clone over. Now, I think the name is self-explanatory. It's just going to duplicate this panel and it's going to overlay it on top. As you can see.
Laura.
Yeah.
I think you can make it easier if you just select the edges. It makes the pattern already. You don't need actually to duplicate it. Right click.
What do I do now?
There was clone as a pattern. Have it there. Clone as a pattern.
Oh yeah, I guess that works. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that works too. Thanks. That's a great tip.
Okay.
All right. I'm still going to complete this here just to show you guys a few things here. So now that I have duplicated this, because there are cases where it's actually quite useful to know this. One thing I want you guys to pay attention to is that if you are using the layer clone over, what it's going to do is that it's going to sew together all the edges that you have selected. So all the edges between the two different panels. Now the clone option probably does that too. I assume it does. And there are a lot of cases where this is actually very useful. If you want to create, let's say, a lining within a shirt or within a coat, this is very, very useful to just duplicate the whole thing. And the fact that it will sew all the edges together will probably make the process of making, let's say, a lining for like a shirt or something else relatively pain-free. But in other cases, that may not necessarily be a great thing. So I just want you guys to be aware that if you do clone something, you will wind up having a whole lot of extra themes like these, you know? And so what I would do in this case afterward, I would take this here, and you can see that these are also still connected, which again is useful if you are making a lining of some kind, so that you can really only have and only need to like do the changes on like one side. But in our case, I don't want to keep that connection, so I will break it once more, and I will once more remove linked editing. And then finally, I just need to select this shirt pocket here, and I need to simply cut it out and get rid of this. And let me finish with this sewing right here. Just like that. Now, of course, if I want this shirt pocket to have a bit of volume, this piece here will probably have to be slightly wider than the piece it is connected to. So I'll just make it just ever so slightly wider here. It's going to help to just give just a bit of volume to it. All right, guys, that's kind of it. I haven't kept an eye at all on the Q&A questions chat, but I don't think there's any questions in there. That's kind of it. That's the basic introduction to Marvelous Designer. If you guys are new to Marvelous Designer, there is a whole lot of other content waiting for you on Outgang.studio. that follow right after this one. The process, if you go through the classes that I have recorded for the garment creation, what you'll see is that the process changes quite a lot. Like everything we've seen so far is very useful to create basic patterns. And if you're really great at like thinking through what kind of 2D panels do you need to create a particular 3D shape, if you will, you could conceivably model anything you want really inside Marvelous Designer by working in here directly. That is certainly possible. But there are people like me who don't necessarily have, let's say, formal tailoring training. And for me, it becomes a bit too hard at some point to kind of try to think through. Let's say I want to create a complex garment, right? So like, let's say I have this one here. So this belt here character, right? Like if I want to make something like this, it's really, really hard to mentally picture how do these different 2D panels have to be shaped so that the garment will come out pretty much exactly the way that I want it to. I'm not sure what I pressed here. Let me just kill it. Let me just reload the scene. It's not always obvious to think through what kind of shape do you need to give things in a 2D window so that they will give you pretty much exactly what you are expecting as a 3D result afterward, right? It's not always very easy to do that, which is why I like to use an approach where we start by doing sketches, 3D sketches using ZBrush. And then we, that has the shape of the garment that we want. And then we simply extract from that the shape of the panels. So as opposed to create the panels in 2D and then have them afterward kind of give us a proper shape in 3D, we start by defining a proper shape in 3D. And then from that, and especially using unwrapping techniques, we extract a 2D shape out of that. And I like to work like that because I just find that for very complex garments, it's a bit more intuitive as a workflow. And that is the workflow that I present to you guys in the Marvelous Designer classes. That is more or less essentially following this one, if you follow the order of the classes there. That is pretty much the notion that will start with the next class that you guys will listen to, which allows us to do more complex things like these a bit easier because I wouldn't be able to kind of sort of think through what kind of shape panels do I need in 2D if I was working always like this, only in Marvelous Designer directly. Anyway, that's not a skill that I personally have. That's kind of it, guys. So let's move on to our Q&A then. Is there any interesting questions?
Hey, Laura. So, someone had a question because I will just ask for a feedback. But if anyone has a question, then go on.
I got just a quick question.
Yeah, go for it, Soren.
That was a bit. What's the now? How can I say that? The limits. I think it's useful to do a belt or shoulder pad or things like that. It's only clothes like your fabric.
No, there's not necessarily a lot of limits. Like you could actually make some really complex stuff. You can certainly make shoulder pads. You can make belts. You can make knots. There's no hard limit, but there is a point where some things become a little too hard for the sake of it. If you take, for example, if you take a knot, so there's a little knot here that we can kind of look at, all right? It's kind of something that you do for the fun of it, to kind of learn, like this is an actual real life knot. This is the kind of thing that you do for the sake of it, just for the fun of it, really. But so it's possible to do it, but is it a good idea to do it? Is it efficient? And the answer is no, it's not. You often get to the point where things are simply inefficient to be done using Marvelous Designer faster than you reach a point where something is technically impossible to do. So belts, you can do those, relatively easy to do. Inside of Marvelous Designer, they're not necessarily all that complex. The thing with belt, though, the thing with belt is that the complexity of belts is that belts have a tendency to shift around a little bit. And so, like if you're putting a belt around yourself, let's say that you got a shirt and like, just to continue from this here, right? Let's say like I want to have a belt around the waist for some reason. it may not be possible for me to get that belt exactly where I want it to be over the character, because you'll see that things like belt have a tendency to kind of shift and move around a little bit too much, you know? So the idea of a belt is relatively simple. Let's say I want to have a belt around the waist of the character, and it's going to be easier around the waist than around this here because it's a bit tighter. So you'll see that the cloth have a tendency to kind of run up in there. So why don't we start with a rectangle? And we said about 77 centimeters, right? So I'll try to be relatively close to that 77 centimeters because I want this to be, let me turn on Shift Z here to see all the measurements all the time. Let's scale this down until it gets about 77 or so, right? Okay, so I got this here. Let me use the arrangement points. Let me snap this to the character. Let me put it here. Let me maybe play around the offset so that it doesn't interpenetrate by default. So I need something about like this, and then let's connect two sides together. Okay, and let's start simulation. Now, this is kind of the ideal example, perhaps. Interestingly, we have some issues here, which we could work a bit more cleanly and kind of avoid having any issues like these to begin with, but I don't like to work in a clean manner often, so let's just work a bit dirty. In fact, I will work kind of clean in my dirtiness, actually. So one thing we haven't really talked about is the concept of layers. It's just an idea that anything that is on a higher layer, if you select panels, will wind up always being on top of something else. So let me just apply layer 1 here to my belt. And you'll see that this kind of interpenetration will sort of magically fix itself because of that. It usually does, but sometimes Marvelous still also has a bit of hard time. But no, you can see it's kind of progressing. Let's go to GPU mode. Should be a bit easier there.
Yeah, and then you can play with the rigidity of the belt.
Yeah, like you can change the material properties and stuff like that. So this is kind of like a basic start to it. You don't want to keep layers for longer than you have to. So at this point, I want to get rid of the layers because they're prone to creating problems. But now the belt will kind of stay on top because that's where it is right now. Although this will need CPU simulation. So at its most basic implementation, this is kind of how you create a belt. And if you wind up having the belt exactly where you want it to be and life is great, then you're done pretty much. That's pretty much all you have to do, you know? And as you have rightly pointed out, you know, I could create a new fabric here. I could take my belt here. I could apply a new fabric to it and then play around with the simulation properties of this here. So I could say in physical property here, where it says there's a custom preset that is applied by default to it, I could go in here and say, okay, well, actually, I want this to be something relatively rigid. So let's go for some trim full grain leather, which is some really highly rigid stuff. And now you're going to wind up having a belt that will be like it's going to look a lot more solid, you know? But as I said, the problem with belts is that they have a tendency to shift around a little bit. Like this is an ideal situation. But let's say that you were, okay, maybe I want to have a belt around, like maybe there's a belt holding down the sleeve somehow. This one isn't going to work as well. And so I do have solutions for you in that case. But I want to show you what's going to happen first. So let's go ahead here. We want to measure this out, tape measure. Sorry, circumference measure. Okay, 29. So let's go for a rectangle that is 30 by 2. All right, let's do the same thing. Layer 1, it's going to be the simplest way I can do it right now. Seeing this to that. Can keep the rigid material properties, it's great. Now, if you can't really get the result that you want like this, although I think it's going to work, I think it's kind of solving itself well enough, actually. I could have also cut the belt into smaller pieces and then move those pieces in place and then sort of release the pieces or resew the pieces together. But as you can see right now, it's kind of sliding down. It's kind of sliding down very slowly, but you can't really stop it from sliding down. It's just going to keep on sliding down. You could play with the friction. You can play with a whole bunch of stuff to try and keep it in place, but you won't ever really be able to completely control it. So what I'd like to do in that case, at some point, is to do something like this here. I'll find where the belt is connected to the garment under it, and I'll add an internal line at that place. Now, there's other ways to also solve this. This isn't the only solution that you have. But one of the solutions to create an internal line like that and sew this to the internal line so that the belt always stays in the same position in relation to the character. Now, because this garment is a bit too folded over itself, it's probably not going to work all that great. I suspect this won't actually work too well there. Well, it's not too bad, but probably never be completely perfect. I mean, it's not too bad. But so usually the solution to keep belts in place is you need to sew it to whatever is under it, first of all. And sometimes also to use a combination of avatar tapes on top of that.
But would you sew just in one edge or two edges?
Well, two edges is preferable, but one can be enough. Kind of depends. You kind of have to try it and just see what happens. But the thing is, I don't think that we will ever find a perfect solution for this particular thing right here. I don't think we'll ever be able to fully kind of solve this, because even if I sew this to the edge that is under it, the result won't be as natural as what it looks like right now. And it's going to be more akin to an elastic than anything else. So at that point, what I like to do, if I can't get anything great by simply sewing things down, then you have to start to look into solutions like using avatar morph targets and stuff like that, which I talk about. I would rather point you to a moment where I talk about that, because explaining it right now would take some time. But I do talk about how the specific case of belts or other things pressing down on a garment in one of these classes. So it could have been the first one, actually. Let me just check here. Unfortunately, I'm starting to have a little too many things in here. Was that during a Q&A? Someone asked a question about that. I even wonder if Kalosita wasn't you to ask me about that during like the first or second class.
The morph target, no?
Yeah, the morph target. Yeah,
I know you did it. I don't remember where. But in terms of, because sometimes I don't know, to differentiate the solidify and the freeze and so I think sometimes can help, but it would be nice if you could just next time or something, because it's almost we are almost done. Differentiate in which case you use solidify or strengthened, because sometimes it's something that I would like to see in the different examples. Which one you think it's best for each cases?
I don't actually use these options like at all. Both solidify and strengthen. I just don't really use them. So solidify has some uses. If your character changes pose and you want to keep some folds that were on a previous pose, and they are useful. I don't personally use them. I guess they just never really made their way into my own personal toolbox. Like, I have more of a tendency to change material properties for something more rigid than play around with solidify or strengthen, because it will more or less kind of give you the same thing. If you take something and you give it a full grain leather material property, it's pretty solid. So you could use those. I don't use those personally. There's no reason why you can't use those. Just personally for me, it's not something that really made its way to my own toolbox. The the topic of belt is one that comes back a lot, and so I do talk about it here and there, especially in the Q&As for the Mars designer classes. But there's as many techniques to create these things as there can be cases. Maybe what you could do is maybe also bring me like a reference at some point. Like, we'll have a Q&A next week that is also for this particular class. So we can definitely talk more about that. Maybe you can bring me like a reference, and then I'll tell you how I would approach creating that very specifically.
Yeah, sure. I'll do that. Thank you.
All right. Any more questions?
Okay. Can I show what I have for feedback?
Is it Marvelous Designer related, or is it something else?
Yeah, it's that woman that I'm doing. I already have all the clothes already done on ZBrush, and I would just want to ask if it's all good, if it's all correct. So
yeah,
no problem. All right. Yeah, I have some really specific questions that would really that I'm really curious about when you look at it now. So when you open I've already sent the link.
Before I do that, I think there's a quick question here from Pier Paolo in the Q&A questions. I was wondering if you would approach creating thick seam like the ones you would see at the borders of a real t-shirt with cloth is folded and sewn together. Pier Paolo, I would invite you to check out the class, which name is, because I got you covered already. Look for the skirt and seams class. You'll have the information that you are looking for in there. Hey, some really good progress here.
Yeah. So basically, what's really interests me is like how is it going out for as of now. But the other thing that I want to know is that how I approach doing the clothes is I exported the clothes from Marvelous Designer as a high poly. Then I did the whole workflow, importing it back into ZBrush and then trying to zero mesh, but I couldn't zero mesh because when I tried to import it back to Maya, I couldn't get proper UVs. So what I did was like that technique where you just flatten out the UVs in ZBrush, and that's how you zero mesh. So you can see that some of the clothes, they're not seamed, they're not welded. Like the skirts, you'll see that it's not welded, and I think that it's not a problem in the end if some clothes are not welded, because when you bake it, you can fix any seams in Photoshop. Okay, all right, that's fine.
Yeah, because like this is not your low res. It could be a start for your low res, but it's not your low res. Like your low res, you would fix all these welding. Like obviously when you make your final low res, you will weld everything that needs to be welded. So the fact that on this high res your panels are not welded does not change much.
Okay. Yeah, and the other thing is that I tried to do the seams in Marvelous Designer, but my computer is not that powerful, and I can't simulate detailed seams, so I'll just do that on ZBrush. So that's what I decided to do. And I've uploaded the concept art, the concepts on Discord, and with the cape. There's one thing when we look at the concept and when we look at the 3D model is the necklace, the cross that's a cross. Do you think that the cross on the concept is logical? Because when you look at it, it's connected to the capelet, but when it's connected like that, I feel like it's gonna pull the capelet because the cross is that heavy, and it's gonna pull it down, and it's not gonna sit properly on the shoulders. And that's why I changed the design that's why I changed the design, so the necklace can be around the neck rather than connected to the capelet. I'm not sure if you can see the correlation between that and if it's logically constructive.
I'll give you some general feedback before we talk more specific. I mean, I'll answer your question, but first of all, let me just give you some more general feedback. I feel in general, my feedback would be that I think that clothes in general are starting to be a little too full, too ample overall. Like, I wonder if I wouldn't actually try to make things, like I want to go for something form fitting because that's really what a concept is. That's really not what a concept is. In fact, let me just open it here so we can all look at it together. So the concept looks like this. I wonder if I wouldn't go for things that are a bit less ample. Like if I'm looking at this portion here versus what you have, like the fact that you have all these gathers there and they're actually very ample, like it adds a lot of cloths. Like in general, it feels to me like the cloth may have been made for someone who was kind of a bit wider than she is. So that's the first thing I would kind of tell you. Like if you have a chance to go back to Marvelous and try to make some of these a bit more form-fitting, I think it would be a good idea to do so. Especially like the sleeves, like the amount of cloth that you have here. I think it's still too much. Like I think there's just too much of it. And so if you reduce the amount of cloth, you make it look more form-fitting. I think that the silhouette of the character will also improve because the silhouette will start to look less amorphous and will simply take on more the shape of the character. I have some concerns over the amount of compression that is happening around the waist. I feel like maybe it's too much. Now, I think I get the impression that it's too much because I think there's too much contrast between the different volumes that you have, Like this looks very thin in relation to how baggy everything here is near the bottom, So I don't know if you necessarily need to make the waist wider necessarily, but I think that there's a bit more balance in between the different volumes. I think would help. We don't normally tell people to reduce the contrast in volumes that they have. That's not a feedback that we often give. Because it's usually the other way around. People make stuff that's a little too skin tight. But I think in your case, like your cloth kind of deserves a bit less amplitude. Sooner or later, before you finish your high res, I don't know how far along you think this is, but sooner or later, before you finish the high res, you will have to add more life to your cloth, make your cloth just look more lived in, and add a bunch of memory folds and add a bunch of different stuff, Like if you actually compare this right now, it could be that you intend to do that and you haven't done it yet. And if that's the case, don't take this as a negative feedback, but I guess just to lay out essentially what I usually expect in that particular case, Like if you take a look at Vaclav, again, like the character that I've shown at the start of the class, either you or I have some massive scale issues, and it's probably me. If you look at the clothes here, so they've been hand sculpted to look very lived in, very old, Like if you take a look at the pants, right, it's like, I have all these nice folds that you would get out of Marvelous Designer, but on top of them, I went in there and I really added a bunch of memory folds. I kind of have these normal wrinkles that kind of transition into like sharper memory folds. It really helps to make the cloth look alive, look like he's really been wearing this. If you take a look at the the lab coat here, it's practically all memory wrinkles, really. Like it's like most of this is just memory wrinkles left and right because he doesn't really care. It's like his clothes, like he doesn't take that well care of them. So, you tend to have all these like sort of wear and tear that kind of builds up within the cloth a bit left and right, And so there's definitely a layer of that is missing right now from your own garment that I would expect to see before we can call the high res done. One thing that I like to do, like if you just want, like, this is a really, really quick tip, all right? But if you like to make something look a bit more worn, like obviously you have to go in there and start sculpting memory folds and like stuff like that. But one of the things that's also kind of nice, maybe to make things look worn, like just as a very quick tip, is just add a bit of noise to the surface. Let me go in here, just create a new layer in this. Let me go into surface here. Let me turn on noise. And let me just play around with these values right now. Like you'll get different results playing around with these kind of curves. You don't have to create anything specific, but long as you play around with it, you'll get something kind of interesting.
Yeah, I basically use masking alphas from Pablo's ZBrush tutorial where you can just drag a mask which has some folds, and then you move around with the move brush.
Yeah, that's pretty useful. I like to add these basic noise passes before I start playing on very specific alphas and stuff, because it helps to just build a bit of a consistent noise throughout the whole thing. It helps to make it all look a bit more uniform. Although I don't usually keep this as just one layer and then that's it. Like what I'll do there too is that I will simply create a morph target. I will erase this layer here with the noise I created. I will recreate it. And in fact, let me just... why's my noise still here? It's probably still displayed. Yeah, okay. Let's do apply to mesh. Create a new layer, apply to mesh, create a morph target. Delete the layer, create a new layer, then just use the morph brush. Change the shortcut of this, it seems. And you can get like a bit of noise that kind of appears a bit left and right, so that you don't wind up having something that is completely even, and like doing these kind of noise passes, they just help to build just a bit of wear that is a bit more general, and then afterward on top of there, and then in there afterward, then you go with like more specific alphas and you start to really kind of do more specific stuff there. But these are great just to build a bit of information there so that it doesn't look completely empty as you get started. Yeah, so I would overall reduce a bit of the cloth that is going on. There's a few places here that I'm not that big of a fan of what's happening. Let's say that we take a look at the sleeves here. I'm not a big fan of there feels like there's a lot of tension in this little zone right here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like... Yeah.
I have the Marvelous Designer file that contains these folds that I made, because what I did was I on the end of the sleeve I just made it much tighter, and that's how the folds were made. And of course the garment is it has way too much material, because that's at least how I looked at the concept and the references that I just sent on the subscriber chat. I think that's what I had in my mind. But if it makes too much noise, I would understand, and I will fix that. But the other thing that you mentioned about the skirt, not the skirt, but the coat, which kind of looks like a skirt. I used a reference which had something similar as a design, but I don't know. If you look at the reference like that I sent, you can say if it makes any sense with what I did and what we have.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it certainly makes sense. Like you're essentially you're making a creative decision to step away from the concept and go closer in this direction, which is something that I like to do on a regular basis. So I certainly invite usually people to do what you've done. So yeah, I mean, I think that's great. And if this is what you want to go for, then I guess that's kind of the result that you have. So that's good. Yeah. I still feel that there's maybe a bit too much amplitude to them, though. But the fact that that's kind of the construction that you're going for, I find this very interesting. I think that's a good reference. Yeah. Of course, I can play around with
just lowering the amount of folds. Of course, yeah. And you said there is too much compression around the corset, right? Because it creates much more tapering like an hourglass, almost like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And another thing about the capelet, when you look at the capelet from the backside, do you think that it kind of looks strange? Because I try to simulate proper folds, but the thing that kind of bothers me is how on the edges it's all flat. I mean, I know that it will be flat because that's how folds will be simulated, but from a design perspective, I'm not sure if I'm the only one kind of bothered by how it looks like. Because when
I'm
we
kind of bothered with that too.
Yeah, because when we look at the concept, the folds are made like that because the character has raised her arm, and right now, if I want to make a character in an A pose, and if I want to pose it, like it's gonna be a different story. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I should just do the folds in ZBrush or play around in Marvelous Designer to do that.
I would. I don't think you're necessarily done with Marvelous Designer on this. Like you could give this another try. One thing I wanted to point out, I mean, I think you have correctly pointed out that the cape needs improvement. And like this is kind of a bit bothersome. These are like also like maybe a too straight down. Like this whole thing almost starts to look almost like a bit hard surfacey, because everything's a little too perfect on it right now. But I would give this another spin inside Mars Designer. I wouldn't call that quits yet. One thing I wanted to mention, maybe coming back to the sleeve here, is that I think that there's also issues with how long the cloth is on the front of the sleeve versus the back of the sleeve. Because on the back of the sleeve here, there seems to be a lot of tension. Like this is a huge tension fold. In fact, all of these are, that is kind of connecting. There's a lot of tension here, and there is tension here from the elbow itself. But the fact that you can see a tension fold that connects these two tension zones together means that the cloth has to be very tight between those 2 points. And so this kind of suggests to me that there's a lot of tension on the back here, whereas on the front, there's all this massive looseness here, this massive part here that is just sticking down. It's very, very loose, So you kind of need to balance, like make the back here, make the pattern a bit wider on the back or a bit longer on the back so that you don't have as much tension that kind of seems to be suggested by all these folds. And then on the front, you need to make it shorter so that you remove a lot of this kind of weight that is building up here,
Yeah. I remember that I had a hard time trying to get the proper folds on the sleeves that I wanted. Mostly because the character has some gloves, and I really wanted to show that when she has these gloves, like the folds will be compressed, and that's how it will get a little bit more puffy.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, but I think in the execution, I think you can balance it a bit better.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to answer your question about the chain here. So you were saying that you did not connect this chain to the pattern because you were afraid that that it would weigh too much on the pattern, right?
Yeah. Because when I just look at the concept, I would imagine that if this necklace, this chain and the cross, if it's connected to the capelet, it will pull down the capelet down way down to the ground, and
it will.
And I think that if someone else looks at it, he will agree with me because more or less not always the concept art has to be one-on-one with reality. So
yeah, what I like about the concept that you don't have right now is because there is this connection between the chain and the concept. You can see a bit of tension folds.
Yeah.
That comes out of this point of attachment. So I'm not sure I would necessarily sacrifice that too quickly, because there's actually quite a lot of things that you could do. Like if I'm here, right, like one of the things that I could do to simulate that chain is I could make a chain and simply play around with the weight until I get a weight that I kind of like, like for example.
I actually have the Marvel Designer file again in that link. If you can open that if you wanna demonstrate it.
I think it's going to be simpler to show it here.
Okay.
Simpler, so I'll just get this here going, right? Like the way I would do something like this is by simply doing something like that. You kind of, as opposed to like try and make an actual chain or something else, you quite simply just sew a piece of cloth like that. Here to here, here to here, should be longer. And then for now, let me freeze everything. Only simulate this kind of chain-like thing. Guess it's not connected. And like this being a separate piece of cloth means that you can actually give it a weight that you want, you know? Like you could make it only very lightly heavy so that the amount of pulling that it does is actually very small, you know? Let me just add a new fabric here, apply this to it, call it chain. Then what kind of properties could we give it? I don't know, let's use a, I don't know, just use some default thing. Not sure how it's going to turn out, but you know, now I can actually control the amount of weight that this applies on the garment. Like right now, it's not creating much, but I could actually take this here. And one of the things I could do, I could go into my presets, right in my details, and I can actually make the density of this higher. So as I scroll down here, down to my material properties, there's this density value here. If I want this to be heavier, I could just increase this. And you can see it's starting to drop down. So depending on how dense you kind of make this particular piece of garment, you'll get more or less of that pulling that will kind of apply. So you can find kind of like the sort of density value that it really gives you just the right amount of pulling without starting to completely like pull the whole thing down, you know?
Yeah.
And then if it's not enough, we could always add a bunch of weights. But my feeling is that this will be, you'll have the issue where maybe this is too much as opposed to being not enough, you know? But yeah, like if I put this like all the way to like 100, like it's going to start to weigh quite a lot. And as this pulls down, it's going to start to create a bit of that tension that we want on these 2 points there. It should be enough. If it's not enough, you could always attach a weight to this, like an actual weight.
Yeah. I remember that I tried to do something similar. I changed the preset to a leather because like leather is stiff and supposedly heavier, but I couldn't make the pulling effect where the folds are like generated by the pulling of the chain. I don't know. Probably you said that you can add a weight to make it.
Yeah. Like if this doesn't give me exactly what I'm looking for, we could add a weight to this. Yeah, which is actually very simple. Let's go to let me load a sphere. There are a few of those actually. If you go to hardware and trims, we could go here to button. Let me see here. Could maybe add a button because I don't know if there's any good weights in here, but default. But I know there's a few. Hardware, interior, fabric. If not, I could just load something from that is external, of course. But I want to see what's already in here that I could use. Because there used to be a bunch of stuff in here, but I don't know, maybe they removed them. There used to be like buckles and like other stuff like that you could use. I don't know where these things are gone, if they're gone somewhere. Avatar, maybe? Yeah, it's fine. Let's just go to... I don't want to go to ZBrush because I'm not sure about the scale of things. I could always try it. Okay. Let's just make a sphere here. Just a default sphere. It's going to wind up being 2 centimeters large by default. Let me scale that down a little bit. Okay, let's export that out as an OBJ. Let's call it weight. Let's go in here. Let's go to File, Import. Import the OBJ, import the weight. Now let's load this here. Load type, or rather object type, let's load this as a trim. Let's add it to the scene. Hopefully it's going to be the right size. Yeah. So, is that it? What is that? No, that's just a rectangle.
I think there's something on the bottom between the shoes
I
on
think I have
the
selected.
3D window. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So let me take this now. Then let me click on the little glue here. This little glue icon and say I want this to be glued here. And now this will stay connected to your character. Now this is a weight. So by default, this is super tiny. It's not going to weight a lot, but you can actually change the weight of this thing while it's selected. So name mesh, which means that it's selected. Weight here. So I could say this is 100 grams. Not sure how much 100 grams is, but I assume that's probably a lot. There you go. So you can actually control the weight of this. See how it's kind of pulling down? It's not pulling down too much, but it's pulling down a bit. If I add a 0 to this, it's gonna drop a lot further down. Yeah, so I would say just play around with that. You'll be able to get something that you like with this, just by tweaking the weight until you get the proper weight that is just enough to pull down without sagging down too far.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I would imagine that the chain alongside with the cross, probably there's like a kilo there, or less. So yeah, I think I can do something with that.
Yeah, I don't think it matters too much that you be like that.
Yeah.
Exact weight. Just go for something that looks good in the end.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, that answers everything. I appreciate that you looked at the model.
Yeah.
And that you showed me how to do the weight technique.
Cool. All right, guys. Any other questions? If you guys, you also have the week then to formulate questions. And so essentially next week's class is Introduction to ZBrush, but we will have the Q&A for this week essentially, or we will have another Q&A next week, right before that class starts. During the week, I will communicate to you guys a more precise sort of outline of when to expect for the Q&A to start and then the class to start, although it's probably not going to change. It's probably still going to be at 12, but we'll see how we arrange the schedule there. So if you have more questions as far as Marvelous Designer is concerned during the week, please ask them in the Q&A questions chat channel or text channel on Discord. And next week, we will bundle them up and we will answer all of them at the start of the class during the Q&A before we move on to ZBrush. That's it, guys. I hope this was a good class. I hope you have appreciated it. I thank you guys who are still here for staying until the end, and I will see you all next week. See you guys.